They found the fourth one in the east wing on a winter morning so cold the servants' breath hung like ghosts in the corridors. Lady Catherine Ashford, 23 years old, sprawled across the marble floor in her nightgown, with her neck twisted at an angle that made even the hardest men look away. No one had heard her scream, no one had seen her fall, but everyone knew what it meant. Duke Alaric Ravenshade had killed again. At least, that's what they whispered in every drawing room from London to Edinburgh, their voices dripping with the kind of delicious horror that only comes from tragedies happening to other people. But whispers are cheap currency in a world built on secrets, and the truth, the real truth, is always uglier than any curse. Stick with me through this darkness, because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about monsters and the men who wear their faces. Disham. The telegram arrived at the Hart household on a Tuesday, which Evelyn would later think was fitting because Tuesdays had always carried a particular variety of cruelty in her experience. Nothing catastrophic, just the slow accumulation of small humiliations that reminded you exactly where you stood in the world's estimation. Her father didn't look at her when he passed the paper across the breakfast table. The yellow slip trembled between his tobacco-stained fingers, and Evelyn knew before she read a single word that her life had just been sold. Terms accepted. Engagement formalized. Duke Ravenshade expects your arrival within the fortnight. Arrangements made. Congratulations. The word congratulations sat there like a curse. Evelyn set down her teacup with the kind of careful precision that comes from years of converting rage into stillness. Across from her, her younger sister Margaret stared at her plate, 18 years old and already perfecting the art of strategic invisibility that kept her safe from their father's desperation. You have to understand something about Anthony Hart. He wasn't evil in the way villains are supposed to be evil, with grand schemes and deliberate malice. He was something worse, a weak man with expensive tastes and a title that meant nothing without money to prop it up. The Hart family name had been bleeding credibility for decades, each generation finding new and creative ways to squander what little remained. Anthony had simply accelerated the process through bad investments, worse gambling, and the kind of pride that insisted on maintaining appearances long after the foundation had rotted through. By the time the creditors started circling, there was only one asset left worth anything: Evelyn. 26 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind that she'd weaponized into a modest career writing society columns for the London Observer. Nothing scandalous enough to truly ruin the family, but enough to make every proper gentleman look elsewhere for a wife. Which had been exactly the point. But Duke Alaric Ravenshade wasn't looking for a proper wife. He was looking for a sacrifice. Who volunteers to marry a man suspected of murdering 4 women? Evelyn Hart, investigative journalist underneath the society page facade. A woman interested in exposing the real story behind the curse, not just being another body in the Ravenshade graveyard. Why does she take the deal despite knowing she's likely walking to her death? Because her survival instincts run deeper than her fear, and she's never been the kind of woman who dies quietly. Evelyn took the telegram between her fingers and read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle into the reality she'd been trying to avoid for weeks. 3 months ago, her father had first floated the idea over dinner like it was a reasonable proposition rather than a death sentence. The Duke of Ravenshade was looking for a new bride, and despite his rather unfortunate history with engagements, the financial compensation for the family would be substantial. Substantial enough to clear every debt, restore the Hart name, and secure Margaret's future. All it required was Evelyn's willingness to become the 5th corpse in a very public pattern. She'd laughed, actually laughed, the sound harsh and brittle in the dining room. Then she'd seen her father's face, not pleading, not apologetic, but already resigned to a decision he'd made without her, and realized he was serious. The argument that followed had been vicious. Evelyn had said things she'd never be able to take back, accusations that stripped away the polite fiction that they were still a family rather than hostages to each other's failures. Margaret had cried. Her father had shouted. And in the end, when the rage finally burned itself out into ash and exhaustion, Evelyn had looked at her sister's terrified face and understood that she'd already lost. Because here's what nobody tells you about sacrifice. It's never actually noble. It's just the least terrible option in a situation where someone with power has decided you don't get good choices anymore. Her father was a coward. The aristocracy that created this arrangement was corrupt, and Duke Ravenshade was either a murderer or the unluckiest man in England. But Margaret was 18 and innocent, and Evelyn loved her more than she loved her own survival. So she'd said yes, not graciously, not willingly, but yes. Evelyn folded the telegram and placed it beside her plate, then looked at her father directly for the first time that morning. Anthony Hart had aged 20 years in the past 3 months, his face sagging with relief and guilt in equal measure. I could describe his cowardice here, but you already know men like Anthony. He told himself he was doing what needed to be done for the family. He convinced himself that maybe the rumors about Ravenshade were exaggerated, that surely 5 deaths couldn't all be murder, that there had to be some rational explanation. He promised himself he'd make it up to Evelyn somehow, someday, with the kind of vague future redemption that absolved present sins. He was lying to himself on every count, and somewhere deep in his whiskey-soaked conscience, he knew it. Evelyn's voice came out flat and cold. "So when do I leave?" "Your train departs Friday morning," her father said. His eyes slid away from hers. "The Duke has arranged for a private car. His solicitor will meet you at the station with the final contracts." Contracts. As if this were a business arrangement rather than a potential murder plot. Margaret made a small sound that might have been a sob, but when Evelyn looked at her, her sister's face was carefully blank. They'd already said their goodbyes in the way sisters do, through silences and gestures and all the things that didn't need words. Margaret knew what this cost. She'd spend the rest of her life knowing. That's its own kind of cruelty. But at least Margaret would have a life to spend. "What does the contract say?" Evelyn asked. "Standard engagement terms," her father said quickly. Too quickly. An initial settlement to the family upon signing, the remainder following the wedding. The Duke was very generous. Evelyn felt something like laughter trying to claw its way up her throat. Generous? What a perfect word for blood money. "And if I die before the wedding," she said. "Like the others, what happens to the money then?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Her father's face went gray. "The initial settlement is non-refundable," he whispered. "It's already been transferred." There it was. The truth beneath all the self-deception and desperate justifications. Her father had already spent her life away. Even if she wanted to back out now, even if she ran to Scotland or threw herself on the mercy of distant relatives, the money was gone. The debts were cleared. Margaret's future was secured. Evelyn Hart had been sold, and the transaction was complete. She stood from the table with the kind of eerie calm that comes after acceptance, when rage has burned so hot it transforms into something colder and sharper. "Let me pack." But her father reached across the table, his hand trembling. "Evelyn, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. If there were any other way—" "There is another way," Evelyn said quietly. "You could have been a better man." She left him there with that truth, climbing the stairs to her room, while her father's apologies echoed behind her like the prayers of a coward who'd already chosen his salvation. Wham! The train to Ravenshade Estate cut through the English countryside like a blade through flesh, all smoke and speed and industrial violence against the pastoral landscape. Evelyn watched the rolling hills blur past her private compartment window and thought about patterns. Pattern recognition was what made her good at her job. While other society columnists were content to report who wore what dress to which ball, Evelyn had built a career on reading between the lines of high society's carefully constructed narratives. She'd exposed financial scandals through inconsistencies in reported investments. She'd unraveled affairs by tracking who arrived at which estate and when. She'd learned that the aristocracy's greatest weapon wasn't their money or their titles. It was their control over information and their absolute confidence that no one would look beneath the pretty surface they presented to the world. But Evelyn always looked beneath. She'd spent the past 3 days at the British Library digging through archived newspapers and death records. If she was walking into a murder plot, she was going to understand exactly what kind of killer she was dealing with. The first fiancée, Lady Elizabeth Thornbury, had died 5 years ago. 21 years old, daughter of an earl, engaged to Duke Ravenshade for barely 2 months before she went through the ice on the estate's frozen lake during a January morning walk. The official report called it a tragic accident. Thin ice, no witnesses, her body recovered 3 hours later. But Evelyn had found the coroner's notes buried in the file, and they told a different story. Bruises on Elizabeth's wrist. Lake water in her lungs, yes, but also signs of a struggle. The coroner had noted his concerns, then been quietly overruled by a magistrate who happened to be Duke Ravenshade's second cousin. The second fiancée, Miss Caroline Ashford, had simply vanished. Engaged to the Duke 8 months after Elizabeth's death, she'd gone missing from the estate gardens on a foggy morning. No body was ever found, but her blood-stained shawl had been discovered near the estate's boundary wall. The investigation had been cursory at best, complicated by the fact that Caroline had no powerful family to demand answers. She'd been a merchant's daughter, elevated by the engagement itself, with no one to make noise about her disappearance except a grieving mother who died of heartbreak 6 months later. The third fiancée, Lady Victoria Harrington, had lasted almost to the wedding day. She died in her sleep 3 weeks before the ceremony, and the official cause was heart failure. But Victoria had been 23 years old and in perfect health. Her maid had reported to the constable that the lady had complained of strange pains and nausea in the days before her death, symptoms consistent with poisoning. That particular detail had been excluded from the final report. And the fourth, Lady Catherine Ashford, Caroline's cousin, who demanded an investigation into her relative's disappearance and agreed to the engagement specifically to get access to the estate, had been found in the East Wing with her neck broken. The official story was that she'd fallen down the stairs in the dark. Never mind that Catherine had been an experienced horsewoman who moved with the kind of sure-footed grace that doesn't trip in the dark. Never mind that the East Wing had been locked and supposedly abandoned for years, making her presence there inexplicable. 4 dead women in 5 years. 4 investigations that went nowhere, and one consistent factor: Duke Alaric Ravensshade, who'd inherited one of England's oldest titles at age 25 when his father died in a hunting accident, and who'd somehow managed to remain free despite leaving a trail of corpses in his wake. The pattern was obvious to anyone willing to look. The Duke was either the most cursed man in England, or he was getting away with murder because of who he was and what he represented. Old money, old power, the kind of aristocratic weight that could bend investigations and silence witnesses. But patterns had a way of revealing themselves if you pushed hard enough, and Evelyn was very good at pushing. The train shuddered to a stop at Ravensshade Station, a tiny village stop that existed solely to service the estate. Through the window, Evelyn could see a single figure waiting on the platform, a thin man in an expensive suit, his face sharp with the kind of perpetual disapproval that came from a lifetime of judging people for not meeting standards he himself had never articulated. The solicitor, Mr. Edmund Price, according to the documents her father had shown her, the man responsible for drafting the engagement contracts and ensuring the transaction proceeded smoothly. Evelyn gathered her bags and stepped onto the platform, feeling the weight of the place settle over her like a shroud. The village was dying, that much was obvious. Half the shops on the main street were shuttered, their windows dark. The few villagers visible moved with the hunched urgency of people who'd learned that drawing attention was dangerous. And above it all, visible even from this distance, loomed Ravensshade Manor. The estate sat on a hill overlooking the village like a vulture over carrion. Gothic architecture gone dark with age and neglect, all sharp angles and narrow windows and stone that had absorbed centuries of English weather until it looked less like a building and more like an outcropping of the earth itself. Even in daylight, it radiated the kind of wrongness that made sensible people look away. 4 women had died in that house. Evelyn was betting she could figure out why before she became the 5th. "Miss Hart," the solicitor said, his voice as thin and sharp as his face. "I trust your journey was comfortable." The contract papers were already in his hand. He didn't offer condolences or welcome or any of the social niceties that might have made this transaction feel less like a funeral arrangement. Evelyn appreciated the honesty. She took the papers without responding, scanning the terms with the speed of someone who'd learned to read legal documents in self-defense. The engagement was formalized, yes. A substantial payment to the Hart family, yes. Wedding date set for 6 weeks from now, assuming the bride survived that long. That particular clause wasn't written explicitly, but it hung in the air between them like smoke. "The Duke is waiting at the manor," Mr. Price said. "He's eager to meet you." "I'm sure he is," Evelyn said dryly. "A fresh victim must be quite exciting." The solicitor's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, maybe? or recognition that this particular sacrifice had claws. "The Duke asked me to assure you that you'll be perfectly safe at Ravenshade," he said. "The unfortunate incidents of the past were tragic accidents. Nothing more." "4 tragic accidents," Evelyn said. "What are the odds?" The smile Mr. Price offered her was thin as a knife blade. "Some bloodlines are simply unlucky, Miss Hart. The Ravenshades have carried misfortune in their veins for generations. But I assure you, the Duke himself is blameless in these tragedies." "Is he?" Evelyn said. "Then why does he keep getting engaged? Why does any man seek a wife?" Mr. Price gestured toward the waiting carriage, black lacquered wood and horses that looked half wild. "For companionship, for heirs, for hope that the next time will be different." "Or because he enjoys watching women die," Evelyn said quietly. The solicitor's mask finally cracked. His voice dropped to something colder. "Miss Hart, I understand you fancy yourself an investigator of sorts, that you've made a minor career out of exposing scandals for your little newspaper column. But let me be very clear about your situation here. You are not an investigator. You are not a journalist. You are a woman whose father sold her to clear his debts, and your only value to the Duke of Ravenshade is as a potential bride. If you insist on making trouble, if you ask too many questions or make too many accusations, you will find that troublesome fiancés have a way of meeting with accidents far more quickly than cooperative ones. Do I make myself understood?" The threat wasn't even subtle. Evelyn felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. This man knew something, maybe everything, and he'd just confirmed that asking questions was dangerous enough to warrant intimidation. "Perfectly understood," she said, matching his cold tone. "I'm sure the Duke and I will get along wonderfully." The carriage ride to Ravenshade Manor took 20 minutes through increasingly dark woods, the road winding up the hill in tight switchbacks that felt less like approach and more like descent into something hungry. The driver didn't speak. Mr. Price sat across from Evelyn in frigid silence, and through the window she caught glimpses of the estate growing larger and more oppressive with each turn. By the time they reached the front courtyard, Evelyn had mentally catalogued at least 3 potential escape routes and 2 places where a body could be hidden indefinitely. The grounds were massive, acres of formal gardens gone wild, outbuildings that looked abandoned, and everywhere that sense of watchful decay. The carriage stopped before the main entrance. Mr. Price stepped out first, then offered his hand with the kind of perfunctory courtesy that made clear he'd rather be touching a corpse. Evelyn ignored the hand and climbed down herself, her boots crunching on gravel that looked dark even in the afternoon light. The manor's front doors opened before they could knock. A woman stood in the entrance, 50-something and dressed in severe black that matched her expression. The housekeeper, obviously. Mrs. Thorne, according to the household roster Evelyn had memorized. 20 years of service to the Ravenshade family, survived 3 generations of dukes, and if the woman's face was anything to judge by, she'd seen enough tragedy to make her immune to sentiment. "Miss Hart," Mrs. Thorne said. Her voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd performed this particular greeting before. "Welcome to Ravenshade Manor. His Grace is in the study. He'll receive you after you've had a chance to refresh yourself from your journey." Translation: The Duke couldn't be bothered to greet his new fiancée personally, and she was expected to wait until he decided she was worth his time. Evelyn smiled. How thoughtful. "I'd hate to impose." Mrs. Thorne's expression suggested she recognized sarcasm when she heard it, but had long since stopped caring. She gestured for Evelyn to follow, leading her through the entrance hall and into the manor's interior. The inside of Ravenshade Manor was exactly as oppressive as the exterior promised. High ceilings that swallowed light, dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb sound, and everywhere that smell of old houses, dust and damp, and the particular mustiness that comes from too many years of secrets pressed into stone and timber. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ravenshades staring down with the kind of aristocratic disdain that suggested they'd been just as miserable in life as they looked in death. Mrs. Thorne led her up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, down a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, and finally to a bedroom that was probably meant to be luxurious, but felt more like a very expensive tomb. "Your rooms," the housekeeper said. "Dinner is at 8. His Grace expects you to join him. A maid will be assigned to assist you with dressing and any other needs." "And the east wing?" Evelyn said. "Is it still locked?" Mrs. Thorne's face went carefully blank. Yes, the East Wing has been closed since Lady Catherine's death. His Grace felt it would be disrespectful to her memory to use those rooms while the investigation remained open. Investigation, Evelyn said. I was under the impression the authorities ruled her death an accident. They did, Mrs. Thorne said. But His Grace commissioned a private investigation, for his own peace of mind. How thorough of him, Evelyn said. And what did the private investigation conclude? For the first time, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across Mrs. Thorne's face, that Lady Catherine shouldn't have been in the East Wing at all, that she went somewhere she was explicitly told was dangerous, and that her death, while tragic, was entirely her own fault for not listening to warnings. The message was clear. Stay out of the East Wing or suffer the same fate. Evelyn filed that information away for later. I'll keep that in mind. Mrs. Thorne nodded curtly and left, closing the door behind her with the kind of finality that felt like a lock sliding home. Alone. Finally, Evelyn moved through the room with methodical precision, checking the windows, locked from the outside, she noted, testing the doors. One led to a dressing room, another to a small sitting area. Both empty, both designed to be comfortable cages. She examined the bed, the wardrobe, the writing desk. Everything was expensive and tasteful and completely impersonal, as if the room had been designed for a series of temporary occupants who weren't expected to leave marks. 4 women had probably slept in this room before her. Maybe they'd stood at this same window, looking out at the overgrown gardens and the dark woods beyond, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe they'd told themselves the rumors were exaggerated, that surely a duke wouldn't risk his entire legacy by murdering his fiancées, that there had to be some rational explanation, and maybe they'd been right up until the moment someone killed them. Evelyn unpacked her bags with careful deliberation, hanging her dresses and organizing her belongings with the kind of attention to detail that kept panic at bay. She'd brought her journalist's notebook, hidden in the false bottom of her trunk, her best lockpicks disguised as hairpins, and a small knife, sharp enough to be useful, but small enough to hide in the folds of a dress. She wasn't going to die here, not without knowing why. The knock on her door came exactly 3 hours later, as the afternoon light was fading into the kind of premature darkness that seemed to be Ravenshade's natural state. Evelyn had spent the time reading through her notes on the previous deaths, committing every detail to memory. When the maid entered, a young girl, maybe 17, with frightened eyes and hands that trembled when she curtsied, Evelyn offered her a smile that got no response. The girl helped her dress for dinner in complete silence, lacing up the evening gown Evelyn had brought specifically for this first meeting, dark green silk that made her look both elegant and dangerous, with a neckline low enough to be interesting but high enough to avoid scandal. If she was going to meet the man who'd possibly killed 4 women, she was going to look him in the eye while she did it. His Grace is waiting in the dining room, the maid whispered when Evelyn was ready. She wouldn't meet Evelyn's eyes. Please don't make him angry. The plea was so raw and terrified that Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happens when he gets angry? The maid's hands twisted in her apron. Just don't make him angry, please. Then she fled, leaving Evelyn alone with that warning echoing in the silence. The walk to the dining room felt like a descent into something inevitable. The corridors were darker now, lit only by gas lamps that threw more shadow than light. Somewhere deeper in the house, Evelyn could hear voices, servants probably, moving through their evening routines. But the sound felt distant and muffled, as if Ravenshade Manor itself was swallowing everything human that tried to exist within its walls. The dining room doors were already open. Inside, a table set for 2 stretched beneath a chandelier that needed more light to justify its size. And at the head of the table, rising as she entered, was Duke Alaric Ravenshade. Here's what no one had told her. He was beautiful. Not in the soft way of aristocratic men who'd never worked a day in their lives, but in the way of something carved from stone and left out in the weather until all the softness was worn away. Tall, maybe 6'3", with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes so pale they looked almost colorless in the dim light. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, and hands that were scarred in ways that suggested violence rather than sport. He was 30 years old, according to the records. He looked older, not in his face, which was still young despite the hardness, but in his eyes. Those were the eyes of someone who'd seen things that aged the soul faster than time ever could. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if he didn't use it often. "Welcome to Ravenshade." Evelyn curtsied with exactly the minimum politeness required. "Your Grace, thank you for your hospitality." They stared at each other across the length of the dining room, and Evelyn felt the strangest sensation of recognition. This was a man who'd spent 5 years being accused of murder, who'd watched 4 women die and been powerless or unwilling to stop it, who'd become so isolated by suspicion that he was willing to purchase a 5th fiancée just to prove something, though Evelyn wasn't yet sure what. He gestured to the chair at the other end of the table. "Please, sit." The distance between them was absurd. 20 feet of polished wood separating host from guest, duke from purchased bride. Evelyn walked the length of the table with deliberate slowness, letting him watch her, letting him see that she wasn't afraid. That was a lie, of course. She was terrified. But terror and courage weren't opposites. They were partners, and she'd learned how to make them dance. She sat. A servant materialized from the shadows to pour wine, then vanished again like smoke. Alaric remained standing for a moment longer, studying her with an intensity that felt almost clinical. "Your father tells me you're a journalist," he said finally. "I write a society column," Evelyn corrected. "Nothing so grand as journalism." "Don't lie to me," Alaric said quietly. "I've read your work. The pieces you publish under your own name are gossip. But the investigative articles you write under the pseudonym E. Hartley, those are quite impressive." Evelyn's hand tightened on her wine glass. She'd been so careful with that pseudonym, so cautious about keeping her real investigations separate from her public persona. "How did you know?" "I make it my business to know things about people who enter my home," Alaric said, "especially when those people have a reputation for exposing secrets." He moved finally, walking around the table toward her with the kind of controlled grace that made Evelyn's survival instincts scream. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "So let me make something very clear, Miss Hart. You're here because your father sold you to clear his debts. That's the truth neither of us can change. But while you're under my roof, you will not investigate me. You will not write about me. You will not pry into my family's history or try to solve the mystery of my supposedly cursed bloodline. If you do, the engagement ends immediately, and you and your family can face financial ruin on your own." The threat was delivered calmly, without emotion, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd shouted. Evelyn stood, refusing to let him loom over her. "And if I agree to these terms, what exactly am I agreeing to become? A decoration? A silent bride who asks no questions and sees no evil?" Something flickered in Alaric's pale eyes. Not quite anger, but close. "You're agreeing to stay alive, Miss Hart. That should be motivation enough." "Because your previous fiancés didn't stay alive," Evelyn said. 4 women in 5 years. Strange accidents, mysterious deaths, and you, always at the center, always innocent, always moving on to the next victim. Alaric's face went absolutely cold. "Be very careful what you accuse me of. I'm not accusing you of anything," Evelyn said. "I'm simply stating facts. 4 dead women, 4 investigations that went nowhere, and now me, bought and paid for, walking into the same trap they did." They stared at each other across inches of charged air. Evelyn could feel her heart pounding, could see the muscle in Alaric's jaw tightening as he fought for control. For a moment, just one moment, she thought he might actually tell her the truth. Instead, he stepped back. "Dinner will be served shortly. I suggest you eat. You're going to need your strength for what comes next." Then he left her standing there, walking out of his own dining room without another word, leaving Evelyn alone with the servants and the shadows and the terrible knowledge that she'd just challenged a man who might actually be capable of murder. The dinner that followed was surreal. Servants brought course after course of beautifully prepared food that tasted like ash in Evelyn's mouth. She ate mechanically, her mind racing through possibilities and plans. Around her, Ravenshade Manor settled into its nighttime rhythms, all those old house sounds amplified by darkness, creaking floorboards, rattling windows, the kind of noises that could be wind or could be something else entirely. By the time the final course was cleared, Evelyn had made a decision. She wasn't going to wait politely in her room while someone planned her murder. She was going to use every skill she'd ever developed as an investigative journalist to figure out what really happened to those 4 women. And if that meant defying Duke Ravenshade's orders, so be it. Better to die fighting than to die obedient. She made her way back to her room through corridors that seemed to shift in the darkness, as if the manor itself was trying to confuse her sense of direction. When she finally reached her door, she found it slightly ajar. Evelyn froze. She'd closed that door. She was certain of it. She pushed it open slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run, but running wouldn't save her. Nothing would save her except understanding the pattern, finding the truth before it found her. The room looked exactly as she'd left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. But on her pillow, placed with deliberate care, was a single object. A small portrait miniature, the kind aristocratic women used to carry. The painting showed a young woman with dark hair and a sweet smile, dressed in the style of 5 years ago. Evelyn picked it up with trembling hands, turning it over. On the back, in faded ink, Elizabeth Thornberry, may she rest in peace. The first fiancé. The one who drowned in the frozen lake. Someone had been in her room. Someone had left this as a message. A warning, maybe. Or a promise. Evelyn looked around the darkened room, at the locked windows and the shadows gathering in the corners, and understood with crystal clarity that the game had already started. Someone in Ravenshade Manor wanted her to know that they were watching, that they remembered the others, that she was already marked for death. But here's what they didn't understand about Evelyn Hart. She'd spent her entire career hunting secrets in a world that punished women for asking questions. She'd been underestimated, dismissed, and threatened more times than she could count. And she'd learned that the only way to survive in a game rigged against you was to change the rules entirely. She slipped the portrait into her pocket and moved to her trunk, retrieving her lockpicks from their hiding place. If someone wanted to play games with dead fiancés, fine. But Evelyn was done playing defense. It was time to visit the East Wing. The manor was different at night, not darker. Darkness was just absence of light, something neutral and passive. No, Ravenshade at night was actively hostile, the kind of malevolence that pressed against your skin and whispered that you didn't belong here, that you should never have come, that every step deeper into its corridors was a step closer to joining the others who'd made the same mistake. Evelyn moved through the second-floor hallway with her lockpicks concealed in her palm and her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that felt too loud, too obvious. The gas lamps had been turned down to their lowest setting, throwing just enough light to create shadows without actually illuminating anything useful. Somewhere below, she could hear the servants finishing their evening routines. Distant voices, the clatter of dishes being put away, the kind of mundane sounds that belonged to a world where women didn't get murdered in locked wings of aristocratic estates. She'd memorized the manor's layout from architectural records she'd found in the library archives back in London. The East Wing branched off from the main corridor about 50 feet ahead, separated by a set of double doors that Mrs. Thorne had mentioned were kept locked. Catherine Ashford had somehow gotten past those locks 3 months ago, and she'd died for it. The official story was an accidental fall. The truth was probably something uglier. Truth usually was. The double doors loomed ahead, dark wood reinforced with iron brackets that looked medieval. A heavy chain was wrapped through the handles, secured with a padlock that gleamed dully in the weak light. Evelyn crouched before it, examining the mechanism with the kind of focused attention that made the rest of the world recede. This wasn't fear anymore. Fear was what you felt when you didn't know what you were doing. This was something else, something sharper. The clarity that came from committing to a course of action that could get you killed, but might also keep you alive. The lock was good quality, but old. The kind of mechanism that relied on weight and intimidation rather than sophisticated engineering. Evelyn had picked her first lock at age 14, learning the skill from a burglary case she'd been researching for a school essay. She'd discovered she had a talent for it, the patience to feel the pins through the metal, the delicate touch needed to coax tumblers into alignment. Over the years, she'd refined the skill until it was second nature. The first pin clicked into place, then the second. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, despite the voice in her head screaming that someone could come around the corner at any moment and catch her breaking into the exact place she'd been explicitly told to avoid. But here's what that voice didn't understand. Evelyn had stopped trusting explicit warnings the moment she'd realized they were usually designed to protect secrets rather than safety. When powerful men told women not to ask questions, it wasn't because the questions were dangerous. It was because the answers were. The third pin clicked. The fourth. And then the lock gave way with a soft snick that sounded deafening in the silent corridor. Evelyn unwrapped the chain carefully, lowering it to the floor in sections to avoid noise. Then she tried the door handle. It turned smoothly, well-oiled despite the theatrical padlock. Someone had been maintaining access to the supposedly abandoned wing, which meant someone had been coming here regularly. The door opened on hinges that didn't creak. Evelyn slipped through and closed it behind her, then stood in complete darkness while her eyes adjusted and her other senses reached out into the space ahead. The smell hit her first. Not decay exactly, but age and dust and something else underneath, something chemical and wrong, like cleaning supplies trying to mask organic rot. The air was colder here, as if the East Wing existed in a different season than the rest of the manor. And underneath everything, barely audible, was a sound like wind through cracks in stone. Except there was no wind. Evelyn pulled out the small electric torch she'd brought from London, one of those new battery-powered lights that were supposed to be the future of illumination, but mostly just made weak yellow circles in darkness. She clicked it on and swept the beam across what had once been a grand corridor. The East Wing had been beautiful once. You could see it in the bones of the architecture, in the ornate molding and the marble floors and the remains of what must have been spectacular wallpaper. But time and neglect had transformed beauty into something grotesque. The wallpaper hung in strips, revealing water-damaged plaster beneath. The marble was cracked and stained. And everywhere, covering every surface like a disease, was dust so thick it had formed drifts in the corners, except for the footprints. Fresh footprints, multiple sets, crisscrossing the dusty floor in patterns that suggested regular traffic. Someone had been using this supposedly abandoned wing extensively. Recently, Evelyn followed the clearest set of prints deeper into the corridor, past closed doors that probably led to bedrooms or sitting rooms, past windows so grimy they looked painted black. The footprints led to a staircase at the corridor's end, the same staircase where Catherine Ashford had supposedly fallen to her death. Evelyn played her torchlight over the stairs, looking for anything that might explain a fatal fall. The steps were marble, worn smooth by generations of use, but not cracked or broken. The banister was solid wrought iron, the kind of construction that would outlast the building around it. There was nothing obviously dangerous here. Nothing that explained how a healthy 23-year-old woman with excellent coordination had managed to break her neck tumbling down these particular stairs. Unless she hadn't tumbled. Unless someone had helped her fall. The thought made Evelyn's skin crawl, but she forced herself to think through it logically. Catherine had been investigating her cousin Caroline's disappearance. She'd agreed to marry Duke Ravenshade specifically to gain access to the estate, and she'd been found dead in a wing that was supposedly locked and abandoned, suggesting she'd discovered something worth killing her to protect. So what had Catherine found? Evelyn descended the stairs carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The staircase led to what must have been the East Wing's ground floor, a series of interconnected rooms that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Storage, maybe, back when the manor had needed space for seasonal furniture and guest accommodations. Now they were just empty chambers filled with abandoned furniture draped in sheets that looked like corpses in the torchlight. The footprints continued through the rooms, growing more concentrated as they approached a door at the far end. This door was different from the others, newer, with a modern lock instead of the antique mechanisms elsewhere in the wing. Someone had installed this recently, which meant whatever was behind it mattered enough to protect with current security. Evelyn examined the lock and felt her stomach drop. This wasn't something she could pick with hairpins. This was a serious lock, the kind that required a key or professional tools or time she didn't have. She tried the handle anyway, more out of frustration than hope. It turned. The door was unlocked. Every survival instinct Evelyn possessed screamed at her to leave. Unlocked doors and locked wings where women died were not invitations. They were traps. But she'd come this far, and turning back now would mean living with the knowledge that she'd been too afraid to learn the truth. That fear would eat her alive slower than whatever waited behind this door could. She pushed the door open and stepped into what looked like an office. Not abandoned, not dusty. This room was clean and organized and clearly in regular use. A desk dominated the center, covered in papers and ledgers. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and on the other wall, illuminated by her torchlight, was something that made Evelyn's blood go cold. A map of Ravenshade Estate, marked with locations and dates. And photographs, dozens of photographs pinned around the map like evidence in a murder investigation. Except these weren't crime scene photos. These were surveillance images. Women walking through the manor, women in the gardens, women in their rooms, photographed through windows. Evelyn stepped closer, her hands trembling as she examined the images. She recognized Catherine Ashford in several photos, captured in the weeks before her death. Victoria Harrington was there too, and Caroline Ashford. Even Elizabeth Thornberry, though those images were older and more faded. Someone had been watching all of them, documenting their movements, building a record of their routines and vulnerabilities. This wasn't the workspace of a cursed duke mourning his tragic losses. This was a predator's lair. Evelyn forced herself to breathe, to think past the horror flooding her system. She moved to the desk and started going through the papers with quick, efficient movements. Financial records, mostly. Detailed accounting of estate expenses going back years. But as she dug deeper, a pattern emerged that had nothing to do with household management. Large payments to individuals whose names she didn't recognize. Transfers of funds to accounts in Switzerland and France. And underneath everything, a ledger that tracked something called project continuation with a level of detail that suggested obsession. She was photographing pages with the small camera she'd concealed in her jacket when she heard the footsteps. Not close. Not yet. But unmistakable. Someone was in the East Wing, moving through the rooms she'd just passed through. Someone who wasn't trying to be quiet. Evelyn's mind went blank with panic for exactly 3 seconds. Then training and instinct took over. She shoved the papers back into place, clicked off her torch, and looked for an exit. The room had 2 doors, the one she'd entered through and another on the opposite wall. She tried the second door and found it locked from this side, the key still in the mechanism. She turned it as quietly as possible and slipped through into another corridor. This one was different from the rest of the East Wing, cleaner, more maintained, as if someone lived here despite the official abandonment of these rooms. Evelyn moved quickly but carefully, trying to put distance between herself and whoever was in that office. The corridor ended at another staircase, this one ascending to what must be the East Wing's second floor. She climbed, her boots silent on the steps, and emerged into a hallway lined with bedroom doors. Most were closed, but one at the far end stood open, spilling weak candlelight into the corridor. Evelyn knew she should leave. She'd found evidence of surveillance, possibly evidence of something worse. She needed to get back to her room and plan her next move. But that open door pulled at her with the same terrible gravity that had brought her to the East Wing in the first place. The knowledge that truth was more important than safety, and that leaving now meant never knowing what had really happened to those 4 women. She moved toward the open door, each step a negotiation between courage and self-preservation. The room beyond was a bedroom, and it was occupied. She could hear movement inside, the sound of someone pacing, and underneath that, something else, a voice, low and rhythmic, as if someone was talking to themselves. Evelyn reached the doorway and peered around the edge. The room was a shrine. That was the only word for it. Every surface was covered with objects that clearly belonged to different people. Jewelry, hairbrushes, pieces of clothing carefully arranged and preserved. And covering the walls, floor to ceiling, were more photographs. The same women from the office downstairs, but these images were different. More intimate, more invasive. Women sleeping, women changing clothes, women in moments of private vulnerability, captured without their knowledge or consent. And in the center of it all, sitting in a chair surrounded by his trophies, was a man Evelyn didn't recognize. Older, maybe 60, with the kind of distinguished features that suggested aristocratic breeding. He was holding a photograph and speaking to it in a voice that made Evelyn's skin crawl with its tenderness. "You understand, don't you, Elizabeth? You were always the smartest. You knew this was necessary. The bloodline must continue. The Ravenshade legacy must be preserved. These other fools, they don't see it. They think Alaric can just marry some common woman and produce heirs like we're farmers breeding livestock. But you understood. Pure blood, pure lineage, that's what matters." Evelyn's mind raced to place him. Not Duke Alaric. This man was too old, too comfortable in this space, but someone with access to the manor, someone with authority and freedom of movement. Someone who... Lord Cedric Blackthorne. The name clicked into place from her research. Alaric's uncle, his father's younger brother. The man who'd managed the estate's finances for decades. The man who'd been present for every single investigation into every single death. always ready with explanations and alternatives and reasons why the authorities should look elsewhere. The man who'd just confessed to watching Elizabeth Thornberry like she was a specimen rather than a person. Evelyn stepped back from the doorway as quietly as possible, but her boot caught on something. A loose floorboard that creaked like a gunshot in the silence. Cedric's head snapped up. "Who's there?" Evelyn ran. She bolted back down the corridor, abandoning stealth for speed, her footsteps echoing off the walls like thunderclaps. Behind her, she could hear Cedric shouting, hear him giving chase. The East Wing had become a maze in her panic, corridors branching in directions she didn't remember, doors that might lead to escape or to dead ends. She chose a door at random and found herself in a bedroom that smelled of rot and chemicals. The door had a lock. She threw it and pressed her back against the wood, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Cedric's footsteps approached, then stopped outside the door. "Miss Hart." His voice was calm, reasonable. The tone of someone used to being obeyed. "I know you're in there. There's no point in running. The East Wing is locked from the outside, and I have the only other key." Evelyn said nothing, barely breathing, scanning the room for another exit. One window, but it faced a 3-story drop to the gardens below. No other doors. "I'm not going to hurt you," Cedric continued through the door. "Not if you're reasonable. Not if you understand that what you saw downstairs is simply a precaution. Protection for the bloodline. Surely you can appreciate the importance of preserving proper lineage." The words were insane, delivered in the voice of a man who believed himself perfectly rational. Evelyn felt ice spreading through her veins. This wasn't just obsession. This was ideology twisted into justification for murder. "Those women you killed," Evelyn said, forcing her voice steady. "They were people, not breeding stock." A pause. Then, "Killed is such an ugly word. I simply removed obstacles. Women who weren't suitable. Women who would have diluted the bloodline or corrupted the family with common genetics. Elizabeth was from a good family, yes, but her grandfather had trade connections. Unacceptable. Caroline was a merchant's daughter playing at aristocracy. Victoria's mother was French, imagine the taint. And Catherine, well, Catherine was asking too many questions. "Rather like you, Miss Hart." The knob began to turn, slowly, testing the lock. "But you're different," Cedric said. "Your father is a Hart. Old blood. Impoverished, yes, but the lineage is clean. You could produce acceptable heirs if you're smart enough to cooperate." The lock was good, but not great. Evelyn could hear him working on it from the other side, probably with professional lockpicks. She had maybe 60 seconds before he got through. She moved to the window and looked down. 3 stories. Rough stone walls with minimal handholds. A fall from this height would kill her or cripple her. But the window frame was wide, and there was a ledge running along the exterior wall. Narrow, probably decorative, but potentially traversable if she was desperate enough. She was desperate enough. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave," Cedric said. "Not now that you know, but I promise it will be quick. Painless. An accident, like the others. You'll simply disappear, and eventually they'll find your body in some tragic location." The curse continues. "My nephew remains unmarried, and I continue my work protecting this family from contamination." The lock clicked. Evelyn was already out the window. She caught the ledge with both hands, her legs swinging out over empty air, every muscle screaming as she hauled herself onto the narrow stone lip. The ledge was maybe 6 inches wide, carved into the manor's exterior as some long-ago architectural flourish. It ran along the wall for about 20 feet before reaching a buttress that might provide enough support to climb down. Behind her, she heard the door open, heard Cedric's sharp intake of breath as he saw the open window. Evelyn didn't look back. She pressed herself against the wall and began moving along the ledge, each step a negotiation with gravity and terror. The wind was worse out here, pulling at her dress and hair, trying to pluck her off the wall. Below, the garden stretched out in darkness, and she tried very hard not to think about what 3 stories of falling would do to a human body. "Miss Hart," Cedric called from the window. His voice had lost its reasonable tone. Now it was just cold. "This is foolish. You'll fall." Evelyn reached the buttress and looked down. The stonework provided something like handholds, decorative scrollwork, and architectural details that might support her weight if she was lucky. And if she wasn't lucky, well, At least she'd die trying to escape rather than waiting politely to be murdered. She started climbing down. The stone was rough under her hands, still warm from the day's sun. She moved by feel more than sight, finding holds in the darkness, testing each one before committing her weight. Her arms burned, her fingers cramped, and somewhere above, she could hear Cedric doing something, calling for help maybe, or fetching a weapon. It didn't matter. She was committed now. Down was the only direction that mattered. Halfway down, her foot slipped. She caught herself on a decorative scroll, the stone cutting into her palms, her body swinging out over nothing for a heart-stopping moment before she got her feet back under her. Blood made her hands slick. She wiped them on her dress and kept climbing. The ground came up faster than she expected. The last 6 feet she just let go and dropped, hitting the garden path hard enough to jar her teeth. She rolled to distribute the impact, came up running, and didn't stop until she'd cleared the east wing entirely and was back in the maintained gardens near the main house. Only then did she let herself stop, gasping for air, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and shock. She'd escaped. She'd actually escaped. And she had proof. The photographs in her camera, the knowledge of what Cedric had built in that shrine room, the recorded evidence of his surveillance and obsession. But she was also bleeding, disheveled, and standing in the gardens of a manor where a murderer had just tried to kill her. And somewhere in the house, that murderer was probably alerting the staff, spinning a story about an hysterical fiancé who'd broken into forbidden areas and needed to be restrained for her own safety. Evelyn looked up at Ravenshade Manor, at the dark windows watching her like eyes. She couldn't go to the authorities. Cedric had connections that had buried 4 investigations already. She couldn't go to her room, that's where they'd look first. And she couldn't run because the gates would be locked and the grounds were too vast to cross on foot in the dark. Which left one option. One person who might actually listen, who had as much to lose from Cedric's schemes as she did. Duke Alaric Ravenshade. She had to convince the man everyone thought was a murderer that his uncle was actually the killer. And she had to do it before Cedric found her again. Evelyn looked down at her torn dress, her bleeding hands, the dirt and stone dust covering her from the climb. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd barely escaped death, which meant she looked believable. She headed for the main house, toward the west wing where Mrs. Thorne had mentioned the Duke kept his private study. This was either going to save her life or end it, but at least she'd go down fighting. The study was on the ground floor, accessible through a side entrance that Evelyn found unlocked. She slipped inside, leaving bloody handprints on the doorframe, and found herself in a corridor lined with hunting trophies that stared at her with glass eyes. The study door was ahead, light visible beneath it. Someone was inside. Evelyn didn't knock. She opened the door and walked in, letting him see exactly what condition she was in. Duke Alaric Ravenshade looked up from his desk, and for a moment his face showed something that might have been shock. Then it closed down into that cold mask she'd seen at dinner. "Miss Hart," his voice was carefully neutral. "You're bleeding." "Your uncle tried to kill me," Evelyn said. She was pleased that her voice came out steady despite the shaking in her hands. "He's been killing all of them. The curse is him." Alaric stood slowly, his pale eyes scanning her from head to toe, cataloging injuries and dirt, and the wild desperation that must be written all over her face. "Explain." So she did. Everything. The East Wing, the surveillance photos, the shrine room, Cedric's confession delivered through a locked door, the climb down the exterior wall. She spoke quickly and precisely, journalist training keeping her account factual, even as her body kept trying to shut down from shock. When she finished, Alaric was silent for a long moment. His face revealed nothing. Then he moved around the desk and approached her, stopping a few feet away. "Show me your hands." Evelyn held them out. The palms were torn and bloody from the stone, already starting to swell. Alaric took them carefully, examining the damage with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation. "This is bad," he said quietly. "You need medical attention." "Your uncle is planning to kill me," Evelyn said. "My hands can wait." Alaric's fingers tightened fractionally on hers. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ravenshade, she saw something real in them. Not the cold mask he showed the world, but actual emotion. Rage, maybe. Or grief. Or both. "If what you're telling me is true—" "It is true," Evelyn interrupted. "I have photographs. Evidence. And I heard him confess to watching Elizabeth Thornberry, to judging the women based on bloodline purity. He called them obstacles, Your Grace. He's been murdering your fiancés to maintain some twisted idea of aristocratic breeding standards. Alaric released her hands and stepped back, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might not believe her, that he'd side with his uncle, with family loyalty, with the comfortable fiction that the curse was real rather than the ugly truth that his own blood had been killing women under his roof. Then he turned and locked the study door. "Stay here," he said. "Don't open this door for anyone but me, and don't trust anyone in this house except possibly Mrs. Thorne. She's loyal to the estate, not to my uncle." "Where are you going?" Evelyn asked. "To have a conversation with Cedric," Alaric said. His voice had gone cold in a way that made Evelyn's survival instincts scream warnings. About accountability. He was at the door before Evelyn found her voice again. "Your Grace." "Alaric." He paused, looking back at her. "Don't kill him," she said. "I need him alive to testify, to clear your name, to prove the curse was manufactured." Something that might have been a smile crossed Alaric's face. It wasn't comforting. "I won't kill him, Miss Hart, but I'm going to make very certain he understands that his work protecting the bloodline is finished." Then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone in the locked study with her bleeding hands and the terrible knowledge that she'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. She moved to Alaric's desk and started going through drawers, looking for anything that might serve as a weapon or evidence. The Duke might believe her, but that didn't mean she was safe. Cedric had been orchestrating murders for 5 years without getting caught. He wasn't going to give up just because his nephew confronted him. In the bottom drawer, under financial ledgers, Evelyn found something that made her breath catch. A letter, addressed to Alaric in feminine handwriting. She opened it despite knowing she shouldn't, despite the invasion of privacy, because right now information was survival. "Dearest Alaric, I know you'll think I'm being paranoid, but I have to tell someone. Your uncle has been following me. I've seen him outside my window at night. Yesterday I found him in my room, going through my things. When I confronted him, he said he was just ensuring I was suitable. Alaric, I'm frightened. There's something wrong here. Something wrong with him. If anything happens to me." The letter ended there, unsigned, unfinished, and clipped to it was a notation in Alaric's handwriting found in Catherine's room after her death. She never sent it. Catherine had known. She'd discovered Cedric's surveillance and tried to warn Alaric, and she died before she could finish the letter. Evelyn's hands were shaking again as she folded the letter and put it in her pocket. This was evidence, proof that at least one victim had identified her killer before he got to her, proof that the Duke might have suspected his uncle but hadn't had enough evidence to act, or proof that Alaric had known all along and done nothing. No. Evelyn pushed that thought away. If Alaric had known, he wouldn't have kept the letter, wouldn't have looked at her with that flash of rage when she told him about the shrine room. Whatever else the Duke was, he wasn't complicit in his uncle's murders. Probably. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture. Trust was a luxury Evelyn couldn't afford, not in a house where 4 women had died and she was scheduled to be the 5th. But she needed allies, and right now Alaric was the only option she had. Time passed in that locked study like drops of water falling in darkness, slow, irregular, impossible to measure. Evelyn cleaned her hands with water from a pitcher on the sideboard, wrapping them in strips torn from her petticoat. She examined the rest of Alaric's desk, finding nothing more incriminating than financial records showing the estate was in far worse shape than anyone outside probably realized. The Raven shades were broke, which added another layer of motivation to Cedric's schemes. Control the heir, control the fortune, or what was left of it. When the knock finally came, Evelyn nearly jumped out of her skin. "Miss Hart!" Mrs. Thorne's voice, cold and professional as always. "His Grace requests your presence in the family library." Immediately. Evelyn approached the door but didn't unlock it. "Is the Duke with you?" "No. But he sent me to escort you. He says it's urgent." Every instinct Evelyn had screamed trap, but staying in this study wouldn't protect her if someone wanted her dead. And she needed to know what had happened between Alaric and his uncle. She unlocked the door. Mrs. Thorne stood in the corridor, her face revealing nothing. She looked at Evelyn's torn dress, her bandaged hands, the dirt still clinging to her hair, and her expression didn't change by so much as a flicker. "This way," the housekeeper said, then turned and walked without checking if Evelyn followed. The family library was in the central wing, A massive room lined floor to ceiling with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in generations. When Evelyn entered, she found Duke Alaric standing by the fireplace, his face illuminated by flames that threw his shadow huge and distorted across the ceiling. And sitting in a chair near the fire, hands bound with rope and blood trickling from his nose, was Lord Cedric Blackthorne. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. "Close the door," Alaric said without looking at her. "And lock it." She did, her heart hammering. This was either safety or the final trap closing. No way to know which until it was too late to matter. "Miss Hart," Alaric said, "my uncle would like to tell you something." Cedric's eyes found hers across the room. The reasonable mask was gone. What looked back at her was pure hatred. "You've ruined everything," Cedric said. "Years of work. Years of protecting this family from contamination. All destroyed by one stupid girl who couldn't mind her own business." "I'd say breaking into locked wings and murdering women counts as my business," Evelyn said, "especially when I'm scheduled to be the next victim." "You were different," Cedric spat. "You could have been useful. Pure bloodline, suitable genetics. But no, you had to go snooping, had to play detective, just like Catherine." "So you killed her," Evelyn said. "Pushed her down the stairs." "She fell," Cedric said, "after I explained to her why her cousin had to disappear. After she started screaming. It was self-defense, really." "And the others?" Alaric's voice was soft, dangerous. "Were they self-defense too?" Cedric looked at his nephew with something that might have been pity. "You never understood. Father tried to explain it to you before he died, but you were too much like your mother, soft, sentimental, willing to marry anyone with a title and a smile. The Ravenshade bloodline is ancient, pure. It cannot be diluted by common blood or foreign genetics. Every woman I removed was a threat to that purity. They were people," Alaric said. His voice had gone absolutely flat. "Not threats, not obstacles. People. They were genetic mistakes," Cedric said, "and I corrected them." The room went very quiet. Evelyn could hear the fire crackling, could see the muscle jumping in Alaric's jaw as he fought for control. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You turned my life into a nightmare. Every woman who agreed to marry me died. The entire country thinks I'm cursed. I've been investigated 4 times for murder. I've been isolated, avoided, feared. My own staff is terrified of me. And all because you decided you had the right to kill anyone who didn't meet your standards of genetic purity." "I was protecting you," Cedric said. "Protecting the family. Someone had to make the hard choices." Alaric moved faster than Evelyn would have thought possible. One moment he was by the fireplace, the next he had his uncle by the throat, lifting him half out of the chair. "You didn't protect me. You destroyed everything I tried to build, every relationship, every chance at a normal life, every woman I cared about." "You cared about them," Cedric choked out. "That was the problem. You would have married them, produced heirs with tainted blood. I couldn't allow it." Alaric released him with a sound of disgust. Then he turned to Evelyn. "The photographs you mentioned, do you still have them?" "In my camera," Evelyn said. "The small Kodak in my jacket pocket." "Give it to Mrs. Thorne," Alaric said. "She'll develop them tonight. By morning, we'll have physical evidence to present to the magistrate, along with my uncle's confession." "You think they'll believe you?" Cedric laughed, the sound wet and ugly. "I've been managing those investigations for years. Every magistrate in 3 counties owes me favors. You have no proof that will stand up in court." "We have Miss Hart's testimony," Alaric said. "We have Catherine's unfinished letter. We have the shrine room in the East Wing, and we have you, admitting to multiple murders in front of 3 witnesses." Cedric's face went pale. "You wouldn't." "I absolutely would," Alaric said. "And I'm going to make sure every newspaper in England knows exactly what you did. How you murdered 4 women to protect your twisted ideas about bloodline purity. How you turned the Ravenshade name into a curse just to maintain control over the estate finances." "The estate is broke," Cedric said viciously. "Has been for years. Your father's gambling saw to that. I've been keeping this family afloat through careful management and strategic marriages. Or trying to, before you kept choosing unsuitable women." "So you killed them," Evelyn said, "to keep access to the family accounts." Cedric's silence was answer enough. "Mrs. Thorne," Alaric said, "send for the magistrate and for the constable from the next county over, someone my uncle hasn't corrupted yet. Tell them we have a murder confession and they need to come immediately." The housekeeper nodded and left without a word. Evelyn and Alaric were left alone with Cedric, the three of them forming a triangle around the fire. Outside, she could hear the manor settling into deeper night, all those sounds of old houses breathing. But in here, everything was still and tense and waiting. "This isn't over," Cedric said. "You think exposing me will restore your reputation? The whole country believes you're cursed. They'll assume you're trying to frame me to save yourself." "Then we'll show them the evidence," Alaric said. "All of it. The surveillance photos, the shrine, the financial records showing your embezzlement, Miss Hart's injuries from your attempt to kill her tonight, and most importantly, the pattern. 4 women dead, all of them just before marrying me, all of them killed by someone with access and opportunity and motive. Someone who benefited from keeping me isolated and unmarried." "You benefited too," Cedric said. "The longer you stayed unmarried, the longer you kept control of the estate without interference from a wife or in-laws. That's the theory you've been promoting, isn't it?" Alaric said. "Making sure everyone suspects me instead of looking at you. Making sure I'm so isolated that I have no allies. No one who might notice what you were really doing." "It almost worked," Cedric said. "It would have worked, if not for her." He glared at Evelyn with pure venom. "You should have stayed in London, should have let your father's debts ruin you. Instead, you had to come here and ruin everything." "I saved my own life," Evelyn said, "and probably saved anyone else who might have been foolish enough to marry him." She gestured at Alaric, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not affection. Something more complicated. Acknowledgement, maybe, that she'd done what 4 other women had tried and failed to do. That she'd survived long enough to expose the truth. The magistrate arrived 2 hours later with a constable and 2 deputies, none of whom looked happy about being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. But when Mrs. Thorne showed them the shrine room, when they saw the surveillance photos and read Catherine's unfinished letter, when they heard Cedric's defiant explanations about bloodline purity and necessary corrections, their skepticism transformed into grim determination. Lord Cedric Blackthorne was arrested at 3 in the morning, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been protecting the family, that history would vindicate his actions. They led him out of Ravenshade Manor in chains while servants watched from doorways and windows, their faces showing shock and vindication in equal measure. The curse was broken, not through magic or divine intervention, but through exposure and evidence and one woman refusing to become another convenient victim. Evelyn watched from the library window as the constable's carriage disappeared down the drive. Her hands throbbed, her whole body ached from the climb, and the terror, and the adrenaline crash. But she was alive. And for the first time since arriving at this nightmare estate, she knew she might actually survive to leave it. "Miss Hart." Alaric's voice behind her, soft and careful. "You should rest. Mrs. Thorne will prepare a new room for you, somewhere far from the East Wing." Evelyn turned to face him. "What happens now?" "Now there will be an investigation," Alaric said, "a real one, without my uncle managing the narrative. The deaths will be properly examined, and eventually the truth will come out." "And us?" Evelyn asked. "The engagement?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "I imagine you'd like to break it, given everything that's happened. I'll make sure your father's debts are still cleared. That wasn't your fault, and you shouldn't suffer for his failures or my uncle's crimes." "That's not what I asked," Evelyn said. Alaric met her eyes. "I don't know what you're asking. I'm asking if you want to go through with this," Evelyn said. "The marriage. Once the scandal dies down and your name is cleared, I'm asking if you want a wife or if you just wanted to escape the curse." "And what do you want?" Alaric asked. Evelyn looked at the man in front of her. 30 years old, broken by 5 years of suspicion and isolation, carrying the weight of 4 murders he hadn't committed but couldn't prevent. A man whose entire life had been controlled by someone else's obsession with purity and legacy. A man who'd just turned his only living relative over to the authorities because it was the right thing to do. She thought about the pattern she'd uncovered, the surveillance and control, the way Cedric had tried to determine every aspect of Alaric's future, choosing his brides and eliminating them when they didn't fit the blueprint, the way the Duke had been trapped in a narrative he didn't write and couldn't escape. They were both prisoners of other people's decisions, both trying to survive circumstances they hadn't chosen, and maybe that was enough foundation to build something real. "I want the truth," Evelyn said, "about everything. No more secrets, no more locked wings or hidden rooms or carefully managed narratives. If we're going to do this, it has to be honest. Alaric nodded slowly. The truth is, I'm broke. The estate is mortgaged to the limit. My reputation is destroyed, and I have no idea how to fix any of it. The truth is, I'm sharp-tongued and stubborn, Evelyn said. I ask too many questions, and I don't follow rules I don't respect. I'll probably embarrass you at society functions, and I'll definitely investigate anything suspicious that happens within 100 miles of this estate. Sounds like a disaster, Alaric said, but there might have been the ghost of humor in his voice. Probably, Evelyn agreed, but at least it won't be boring. They stood there in the library while dawn started breaking outside. Two people who'd survived the same nightmare and come out the other side damaged but alive. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even really attraction yet. But it was possibility, which was more than either of them had expected to find at Ravenshade Manor. And for now, possibility was enough. The magistrate returned 3 days later with news that felt like a blade sliding between ribs. Quiet, precise, and absolutely fatal. Evelyn was in the morning room when Mrs. Thorne delivered the summons, her bandaged hands wrapped around a teacup that had gone cold while she stared at the rain hammering against the windows. The housekeeper's face was more rigid than usual, which meant something had gone wrong. Something worse than arrest and confession and evidence that should have been ironclad. His Grace requests your presence in the library, Mrs. Thorne said. The magistrate has findings to share. The walk through Ravenshade's corridors felt different now. Still oppressive, still heavy with the weight of centuries and secrets, but no longer actively hostile. The East Wing remained locked, but now it was a crime scene rather than a hunting ground. Cedric was in custody. The nightmare was supposed to be over. Except Evelyn had learned long ago that nightmares didn't end just because you wanted them to. They evolved. They found new shapes to wear, and sometimes the monster you thought you'd defeated was just the opening act for something worse. The library doors were closed. Evelyn pushed them open and found Duke Alaric standing by the fireplace again, his posture so rigid it looked painful. Magistrate Cornwall sat in one of the leather chairs, his face carrying the kind of careful neutrality that came from delivering bad news to powerful people. And near the window, partially hidden in shadow, stood someone Evelyn didn't recognize. A thin man in expensive clothes, his face sharp with intelligence and something else. Something that made her instincts scream warnings she couldn't quite articulate. Miss Hart, Magistrate Cornwall said, rising, please sit. This concerns you as well. Evelyn remained standing. Whatever was coming, she wanted to face it on her feet. What's happened? The magistrate exchanged a glance with Alaric, who looked like he'd aged 10 years since dawn. Then Cornwall cleared his throat and delivered the blow. Lord Cedric Blackthorne has recanted his confession. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly, her mind scrambling to process what she'd just heard. He what? He claims the confession was coerced, the magistrate continued, that His Grace threatened him with violence unless he admitted to crimes he didn't commit, that Miss Hart fabricated evidence to support a false narrative, and that the surveillance photographs were part of a private security measure rather than predatory behavior. That's insane, Evelyn said. Her voice came out flat and cold. I saw the shrine room, the photographs of women in their most private moments, Catherine's unfinished letter warning Alaric about being followed, the pattern of deaths that all connect directly to Cedric's access and opportunity. About that pattern, the stranger by the window said. His voice was cultured, educated, and carried the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. I'm Solicitor Whitmore, representing Lord Cedric in this matter, and I'm afraid the pattern you've identified has some rather significant gaps in causation. He moved into the light, and Evelyn got her first clear look at him. Late 40s, impeccably dressed, with eyes that assessed her like she was a specimen rather than a person. She'd seen that look before. In courtrooms and investigations where money could bend reality until truth became whatever the wealthiest party claimed it was. Elizabeth Thornberry drowned in a frozen lake, Whitmore continued. Tragic, but the coroner ruled accidental death. The bruises Miss Hart mentioned were consistent with attempting to climb out of icy water, not evidence of assault. Caroline Ashford vanished from the estate, yes, but her blood-stained shawl was found outside the property boundaries, suggesting she was attacked by someone unconnected to the household. Victoria Harrington died of heart failure, which can strike anyone at any age regardless of apparent health. And Catherine Ashford fell downstairs in a wing she'd been explicitly warned was structurally unsafe. Every one of those investigations was compromised, Evelyn said. Cedric influenced the magistrates. He controlled the narrative to protect himself. Or Whitmore said smoothly, a grief-stricken family member tried to find patterns in tragedy because the alternative, that these were genuinely accidents, was too painful to accept. Tell me, Miss Hart, what exactly did you see in the East Wing? Evelyn described it again. The office, the surveillance photographs, the shrine room with its trophies and intimate images. Cedric's confession through the locked door about removing obstacles and protecting bloodline purity. When she finished, Whitmore was smiling. That smile made her want to break something. And did anyone else witness these things? He asked. The photographs, the shrine, the confession? No, Evelyn admitted. I was alone. How convenient, Whitmore said. A woman desperate to escape an unwanted engagement breaks into a forbidden area of her fiancé's home, claims to discover evidence of serial murder, and conveniently has no witnesses to corroborate her story. One might almost think you were manufacturing a scandal to justify breaking your contract. The contract, Alaric said quietly, is irrelevant. Even if Miss Hart fabricated everything, which she didn't, I would release her from the engagement without penalty. She owes this family nothing. Actually, Whitmore said, she owes quite a bit. The initial settlement paid to the Hart family was contingent on the engagement proceeding in good faith. If Miss Hart is found to have acted in bad faith by fabricating accusations against a member of the Ravenshade family, that settlement becomes void. The Hart family would be required to return funds they've already spent, plus damages for defamation. How much? Evelyn asked. The number, when Whitmore named it, was enough to destroy her family 3 times over. This is extortion, she said. This is contract law, Whitmore corrected, and it's remarkably straightforward. Either Miss Hart retracts her accusations against Lord Cedric, apologizes publicly for the misunderstanding, and proceeds with the engagement as agreed, or her family faces financial and legal consequences that will make their current debts look modest by comparison. Evelyn looked at Alaric. The Duke's face was a mask, but she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. He was furious, but fury without power was just noise, and they both knew it. Your Grace, she said, tell them what you found in the East Wing. The office, the photographs. You saw them too. Alaric's silence stretched too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I saw an office, papers. Some photographs that might have been surveillance or might have been legitimate security documentation, nothing definitively incriminating. You saw more than that, Evelyn said. Don't lie for him. I'm not lying, Alaric said, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. I'm telling you what I can prove in court, and it's not enough. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Evelyn had climbed down a wall to escape murder, had exposed a killer, had trusted that the truth would be enough to protect her. And now the man she'd saved, the man whose reputation she'd restored by uncovering his uncle's crimes, was refusing to support her story because the legal consequences were too severe. She understood it, even through the rage. Alaric was broke. The estate was mortgaged. If Cedric's solicitor tied them up in lawsuits over defamation and breach of contract, Ravenshade would collapse completely. The Duke was choosing survival over justice, the same calculation weak men had been making since the beginning of civilization. But understanding didn't make the betrayal hurt less. So that's it, Evelyn said. Cedric retracts his confession, I retract my accusations, and we all pretend none of this happened. Not quite, Whitmore said. Lord Cedric is willing to be magnanimous, given the emotional distress Miss Hart has clearly experienced. He suggests that the engagement be temporarily postponed while Miss Hart receives appropriate treatment for her nervous condition. 6 months, perhaps. Long enough for scandal to die down and for everyone involved to regain perspective. Treatment, Evelyn repeated. You mean confinement. You want to lock me away in some asylum while Cedric walks free. We want you to rest, Whitmore said, to recover from the trauma of your experience, and to reflect on the damage false accusations can cause to innocent people's reputations. The innocent people in this scenario being the man who murdered 4 women and is now threatening my family into silence, Evelyn said. Just so we're clear on the definition of innocence being used here. Magistrate Cornwall shifted uncomfortably. Miss Hart, I understand your frustration, But without corroborating evidence, without witnesses, without anything beyond your own testimony, my hands are tied. Lord Cedric's initial confession is inadmissible if he claims it was coerced, and the physical evidence you describe has been examined by experts who find it ambiguous at best. Ambiguous, Evelyn said. Photographs of women sleeping, women undressing, women in their most vulnerable moments, that's ambiguous? Security documentation, Whitmore said. Lord Cedric was concerned about threats to the Ravenshade family. He maintained surveillance to protect the household. Overzealous, perhaps, but not criminal. He called them genetic mistakes, Evelyn said. He told me through that locked door that he was removing obstacles to preserve bloodline purity. That's not security. That's eugenics and murder. Your word against his, Whitmore said. And given that you're a woman who broke into private areas of an estate while under extreme emotional distress, facing an unwanted marriage arranged by your father, well, the court of public opinion tends to side with established aristocracy over desperate young women with everything to gain from scandal. The trap was perfect. Evelyn could see it now with brutal clarity. Cedric had built multiple layers of protection into his scheme. The initial confession had been a mistake, delivered in rage before he'd understood that Alaric wouldn't automatically support his uncle against an outsider. But once Cedric had lawyered up, once he'd had time to think, he'd recognized the fundamental weakness in Evelyn's position. She was alone. No witnesses, no ally willing to risk everything to support her, and a financial sword hanging over her family that made resistance impossibly expensive. She'd survived the physical danger only to be destroyed by the legal system designed to protect men like Cedric from consequences. Evelyn looked at Alaric again. The Duke was staring at the floor, his whole body rigid with tension. He knew what this was. He understood exactly what Whitmore was doing, but he wasn't going to stop it, because stopping it would cost him everything he had left. That's when Evelyn understood the real lesson Ravenshade Manor had been teaching her all along. Survival wasn't about being right. It was about being willing to do what the other side wouldn't. It was about recognizing when the rules were rigged and deciding whether to play by them or burn the game down entirely. She'd been playing by rules that didn't apply to people like her, trusting that evidence and truth would matter, that the system would work if she just presented the facts clearly enough. But the system wasn't designed to work for her. It was designed to protect Cedric, to insulate him from consequences, to make sure that women who asked too many questions could be neutralized through financial pressure and legal threats without anyone having to actually address whether those questions were valid. Fine, Evelyn said. Her voice came out cold and flat. I'll retract my accusations, publicly, on one condition. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. You're not in a position to negotiate, Miss Hart. I'm in exactly the position to negotiate, Evelyn said, because what I do next determines whether this stays a private family matter or becomes a national scandal. So here's my condition. Cedric agrees to leave England, permanently, takes his blood purity obsession somewhere else. Switzerland, France, I don't care. Anywhere that isn't here. In exchange, I apologize publicly, admit I was mistaken due to emotional distress, and the engagement proceeds as originally planned. Whitmore's expression didn't change. And why would Lord Cedric agree to exile? Because otherwise I take this story to every newspaper in London, Evelyn said. Not as an accusation that needs to be proven in court, as a cautionary tale about women who marry into cursed families. I describe the surveillance, the shrine room, the pattern of deaths. I make sure every journalist in England starts asking questions about why 4 women died at Ravenshade and why the investigations were all handled by the same family friend. I turn Cedric's name into something that follows him everywhere, even if he's never formally convicted. I make him radioactive. You'd be sued for libel, Whitmore said. The Hart family would lose everything. Probably, Evelyn agreed. But Cedric would lose something too. His reputation, his social standing, his ability to move through aristocratic circles without people whispering about dead fiancés and suspicious circumstances. He can stay in England and spend years fighting lawsuits while his name becomes synonymous with murder. Or he can leave quietly, live comfortably abroad on whatever money he's embezzled from the estate, and let this entire nightmare fade into rumor and speculation. It was mutually assured destruction presented as compromise. Evelyn would sacrifice her credibility and her family's financial stability to wound Cedric's reputation. Neither side would win, but at least Cedric would lose something too. Whitmore looked at Alaric. Your Grace, surely you're not going to allow— I think Miss Hart's proposal is reasonable, Alaric said quietly. My uncle has expressed interest in continental travel in the past. Perhaps an extended stay abroad would benefit everyone involved. The Duke's eyes met Evelyn's finally, and she saw recognition there. Not gratitude, not apology. Just acknowledgement that she'd found the only move available that didn't result in complete annihilation. She'd learned the game fast enough to at least take a piece off the board, even if she couldn't win. Whitmore stood. I'll need to consult with my client. This is a significant concession you're demanding. Take your time, Evelyn said. You have until noon tomorrow. After that, I start writing letters to newspaper editors I've worked with. I'm sure they'd love a personal account of life inside England's most cursed estate. The solicitor left with the magistrate, both of them moving with the kind of rigid dignity that came from recognizing a stalemate when they saw one. Mrs. Thorne showed them out, leaving Evelyn and Alaric alone in the library for the first time since the confrontation. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical presence between them. You could have supported my story, Evelyn said finally. You saw the shrine room. You know what your uncle is. I know what he is, Alaric said. His voice was hollow. I also know what I can prove in court. And they're not the same thing, so you chose the estate over justice. I chose survival over annihilation, Alaric said. He turned to face her finally, and the exhaustion in his eyes was devastating. Do you have any idea what Whitmore could do if we push this to trial? The estate is mortgaged to the limit. The Ravenshade name is already destroyed. If Cedric's solicitor buries us in lawsuits, there won't be anything left. Not the manor, not the title, not even the land. Everything my family built over centuries would be liquidated to pay damages. And 4 dead women would still be dead, Evelyn said, without justice, without anyone being held accountable. Welcome to aristocracy, Alaric said bitterly, where power protects power, and the truth only matters if you can afford lawyers expensive enough to make it stick. He moved to the window, staring out at the rain still hammering the grounds. Evelyn watched him and felt something twist in her chest. Not quite pity, but close. He was trapped the same way she was, just in a more expensive cage. Born into a system that valued legacy over ethics, property over people, and maintaining appearances over admitting uncomfortable truths. They'd both been shaped by forces they didn't control and couldn't escape. The difference was that Evelyn had learned to fight against those forces, while Alaric had learned to survive within them. Your uncle will agree to the exile, Evelyn said. It's the best deal he's going to get. Probably, Alaric agreed. And then what? You apologize publicly, admit to being an hysterical woman who mistook security measures for surveillance. The engagement proceeds. We get married in 6 weeks as originally planned, and you spend the rest of your life attached to a family that just taught you exactly how much your safety matters when weighed against financial consequences. The rest of my life might not be that long, Evelyn said. Given Cedric's track record, even exiled, he'll still have access to money, still have connections. What's to stop him from hiring someone to make sure I meet with an unfortunate accident? Nothing, Alaric said. Which is why the engagement ends today. Evelyn stared at him. What? I'm releasing you from the contract, Alaric said. No penalties. The initial settlement your father received stays with your family. I'll claim it was a goodwill payment unconnected to the engagement. You walk away from Ravenshade, from me, from this entire nightmare. And you live. And Cedric? Gets his exile, Alaric said. I'll make it a condition of dropping all countercharges. He leaves England within the month, never returns, and in exchange the family doesn't pursue your accusations. Everyone loses something, everyone gains something, and maybe no one else has to die. It was surrender dressed as pragmatism. Evelyn understood the calculation. Alaric was choosing to protect her the only way he could, by removing her from the situation entirely. It was probably even noble in a tragic sort of way. But it also meant Cedric would face no real consequences beyond geographic inconvenience. He'd live comfortably abroad on embezzled funds, free to continue his obsession with bloodline purity in whatever new location he chose. 4 women had died. Their killer would retire to the continent with his fortune intact. That's justice to you? Evelyn asked. Exile and financial comfort? That's reality, Alaric said. And reality is that I can't protect you if you stay. The moment we marry, you become legally part of the Ravenshade estate. Your property becomes my property. Your safety becomes dependent on my ability to shield you from threats I've already proven I can't neutralize. If something happened to you, I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I'd failed to save a fifth woman. His voice cracked on the number. 5. As if adding Evelyn to the count of Cedric's victims was already a foregone conclusion, rather than a possibility they were actively fighting against. So that's your solution, Evelyn said. Send me away. Break the engagement. Go back to being the cursed duke who can't keep a fiancé alive. Except now everyone will think I fled because I fabricated evidence, which means your reputation stays destroyed and Cedric's stays intact. Perfect. Better than the alternative, Alaric said. Which is what, exactly? Evelyn's voice had gone sharp. That I stay and risk death? That we fight Cedric together and lose everything? That we actually try to build something honest in the ruins of this nightmare? Which of those alternatives are you so afraid of? All of them, Alaric said. He turned from the window to face her fully. Every single one terrifies me, because they all require believing that something good can come from this place, that the curse can actually be broken instead of just reshaping itself into new patterns. And I stopped believing in good outcomes the day Elizabeth drowned. Elizabeth, whom Evelyn had never met, but whose portrait miniature she still carried. The first victim in a pattern that should have been stopped before it claimed 4 lives. The woman who died because Cedric decided her family's trade connections made her genetically unsuitable. She was 21 years old, Alaric said quietly. Brilliant, kind. She used to laugh at my terrible jokes and sketch architectural drawings of improvements she wanted to make to the manor. We were engaged 3 months before my uncle killed her, and I spent the next 5 years being investigated for her murder while the real killer managed the estate finances and selected my next fiancé. So this is guilt, Evelyn said. You're ending the engagement because you think you failed to protect the others. I know I failed to protect them, Alaric said, just like I'm failing to protect you by not being able to prove what my uncle did. The difference is that this time I can at least make sure you survive the failure. By sending me away in disgrace. By sending you away alive, Alaric corrected. Your reputation recovers eventually. Dead is permanent. The argument was circular and exhausting, and Evelyn was suddenly tired of fighting. Tired of the whole situation, the manor, the murders, the legal maneuvering, the impossible calculations about truth versus survival. She'd come to Ravenshade expecting to either solve a mystery or die trying. Instead, she'd discovered that some mysteries couldn't be solved, only managed. That justice was negotiable. That the system protected monsters as long as they had money and connections, and lawyers skilled enough to make evidence disappear. It was the kind of lesson that aged you faster than time ever could. Fine, she said. I accept your terms. The engagement ends. I apologize publicly. Cedric goes into exile, and I return to London with my family's debts cleared and the satisfaction of knowing that 4 women died without consequence because the truth wasn't expensive enough to matter. Miss Hart, don't, Evelyn interrupted. Don't explain again why this is necessary. Don't tell me you're doing this for my protection. Just draft whatever papers need to be signed and I'll be gone by morning. She turned to leave, but Alaric's voice stopped her. For what it's worth, I believe you. Everything you saw, everything you experienced, the shrine room, the surveillance, the confession, all of it. I believe my uncle is a murderer who deserves to hang. And I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I had the chance to make that happen and chose financial survival instead. The admission was raw and honest and completely useless. Belief without action was just another form of cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. That's worth nothing, Evelyn said. Belief doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't stop Cedric from killing again in whatever country he settles in. It doesn't change the fact that you chose property over people. I chose you over property, Alaric said. By releasing you, by making sure you don't become victim number 5. That has to count for something. It counts for your conscience, Evelyn said, not for justice. She left him there in the library, surrounded by books that probably contained profound thoughts about ethics and morality and the responsibilities of power. All useless, all just pretty words that evaporated the moment they encountered real consequence. The walk back to her room felt longer than it should have. The corridors seemed to stretch and shift, and Evelyn realized with dull surprise that she was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears tracking down her face, while her body processed rage and grief, and the bitter recognition of defeat. She'd fought as hard as she could. She'd been brave and smart and resourceful. And it hadn't mattered. The system was designed to protect men like Cedric and punish women like her for asking questions that threatened comfortable narratives. Mrs. Thorne found her in her room an hour later, sitting by the window and staring at nothing. The housekeeper entered without knocking, carrying tea that Evelyn didn't want, and sympathy that was probably genuine but felt hollow. "The Duke wanted me to give you this," Mrs. Thorne said. She placed an envelope on the desk. "Travel documents, funds sufficient to establish yourself in London, and a letter of recommendation from His Grace, should you need employment." "Blood money," Evelyn said. "Survival money," Mrs. Thorne corrected. "Take it, use it, and forget this place ever existed." "4 women are dead," Evelyn said. "How am I supposed to forget that?" "The same way everyone else does," Mrs. Thorne said. Her voice had gone hard. "By recognizing that some battles can't be won, that some truths are too expensive to tell, that survival is its own form of victory when the alternative is joining the others in the family crypt." The housekeeper moved to the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Hart, you lasted longer than any of them. You found more truth than anyone before you, and you're leaving alive, which none of the others managed. That's not nothing." Then she was gone, leaving Evelyn alone with travel documents and blood money and the bitter knowledge that lasting longer than the other victims was supposed to be an accomplishment. The rain continued through the afternoon and into evening. Evelyn packed mechanically, folding dresses and gathering the few possessions she'd brought to Ravenshade. The portrait miniature of Elizabeth Thornberry went into her trunk, a talisman and a reminder. Catherine's unfinished letter stayed with her too, tucked into the journal where she'd been recording everything. Evidence that would never be used. Testimony that would never be heard. But proof, at least to herself, that she hadn't imagined the horror. She was nearly finished when the knock came. Soft, hesitant, completely unlike Mrs. Thorne's businesslike rapping. "Come in," Evelyn said. The door opened to reveal a young woman Evelyn recognized from the servant staff, one of the kitchen maids, maybe 17 years old, with frightened eyes and hands that twisted her apron into knots. "Miss Hart," the girl whispered, "I need to tell you something before you leave. Something I should have said earlier, but I was too afraid." Evelyn gestured her inside. The maid closed the door and stood there trembling, clearly fighting with herself about whether to speak. "It's about Lord Cedric," the girl finally said, "and the East Wing. I saw him there. Multiple times. Late at night, when he thought everyone was asleep. He'd go into that locked section and stay for hours. And sometimes I'd hear sounds. Voices. Women's voices." The room went very cold. "When was this?" Evelyn asked. "All 5 years I've been working here," the maid said, "since before Lady Elizabeth died. I told myself it was none of my business, that Lord Cedric was family and I was just a servant and I needed to keep my position. But then the ladies kept dying. And I kept seeing him in the East Wing, and I knew it was wrong. But I didn't say anything, because who would believe a kitchen maid over a lord?" "Why tell me now?" Evelyn asked, "if you've kept silent this long." "Because you're leaving," the girl said, "because they're making you apologize for telling the truth, and I can't stay silent anymore and still live with myself. So I wanted you to know you weren't wrong, you weren't hysterical. Everything you said about Lord Cedric was true, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up when it might have mattered." The confession was devastating in its simplicity. Here was the corroboration Evelyn needed. A witness who could testify to Cedric's presence in the East Wing, to suspicious sounds and nighttime activities that contradicted his security explanation. This girl could change everything, but only if she was willing to testify. Only if she was prepared to face the same legal destruction Whitmore had threatened Evelyn with. And looking at the maid's terrified face, Evelyn knew that would never happen. "What's your name?" Evelyn asked gently. "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Sarah Collins." "Sarah?" Evelyn said. "If you testify to what you just told me, Lord Cedric's solicitor will destroy you. He'll claim you're lying to get attention. He'll question your character, your morals, your sanity. He'll make sure you never work in a respectable household again. And at the end of it all, your testimony probably still won't be enough to convict him, because you're a servant, and he's a lord, and the system is designed to protect him." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why I'm not going to testify. I'm too much of a coward. I just wanted you to know that you were right, that someone else saw it too." The girl fled before Evelyn could respond, leaving her alone with confirmation that would never become evidence. One more truth too expensive to tell. One more person choosing survival over justice because the cost of justice was simply too high. Evelyn sat on her bed and stared at the rain-dark windows. She thought about patterns and systems and the way power protected itself by making resistance impossibly expensive. She thought about 4 dead women and 1 live, 1 leaving in disgrace. She thought about Cedric boarding a ship to the continent with his fortune and his obsessions intact, free to continue his work in a country that didn't know his history. And she thought about what Mrs. Thorne had said, that survival was its own form of victory, that leaving alive was an accomplishment when others had died. It was supposed to be comforting. Instead, it felt like surrender. Evelyn pulled out her journal and began writing. Not an apology, not a retraction, just the truth, documented in careful detail. Everything she'd seen, everything she'd experienced, Sarah's corroboration, the pattern of deaths, Cedric's confession, Alaric's choice to prioritize property over people. She wrote it all down knowing it would never be published, never be read by anyone who could act on it. But maybe someday, when enough time had passed, when the legal threats had faded and the financial consequences were no longer relevant, maybe then someone would find these pages and understand what had really happened at Ravenshade Manor. Or maybe the journal would be discovered by someone who'd choose to bury it deeper, because the truth was still too expensive to tell. Either way, at least it would exist. Somewhere. A record that couldn't be completely erased by lawyers and legal maneuvering and the terrible weight of aristocratic power. The knock that came at midnight was different from Sarah's hesitant tap. This was authoritative, demanding, the kind of knock that expected immediate compliance. Evelyn opened the door to find Solicitor Whitmore standing in the corridor, his expression glacial. "Lord Cedric has accepted your terms," he said. "He will depart for Switzerland within the month. In exchange, you will sign this retraction and deliver a public apology to the magistrate tomorrow morning. The engagement will be formally dissolved with no penalties to either party, and you will never speak of these events again to anyone under threat of immediate legal action." He held out papers. Evelyn took them and read through the legalese carefully. Everything was there exactly as outlined. Cedric's exile, her apology, the dissolution of the engagement, even a clause protecting her family from financial consequences. It was the best deal she could have hoped for, given the circumstances. It was also complete capitulation. "There's one more thing," Whitmore said. "Lord Cedric wanted you to understand something. The women who died were not murdered. They were unfortunate accidents compounded by a tragic pattern. Lord Cedric mourns their loss as much as anyone. His surveillance of the household was overzealous, yes, but born from legitimate concern for family security. He hopes you can eventually understand that perspective." The gaslighting was almost impressive in its audacity. Whitmore was asking her to not just apologize, but actually internalize a version of events where Cedric was the misunderstood protector rather than the calculating killer. "I understand perfectly," Evelyn said. "Lord Cedric is a murderer who's escaping justice through money and connections and a legal system designed to protect men like him. And this retraction is the price I'm paying to keep my family from being destroyed, as collateral damage in a fight I can't win." Whitmore's expression didn't change. "As long as you sign the papers and deliver the apology, Miss Hart, you can believe whatever private theories comfort you." He left her with the documents. Evelyn signed them with hands that didn't shake, because she'd learned a long time ago that crying was for after, when no one was watching. The signature looked steady and official, completely at odds with the rage and grief churning in her chest. She was finalizing her own defeat, making it legal, making it permanent. And somewhere in Switzerland, Cedric would read about her apology and smile, knowing he'd won. That was the worst part. Not the defeat itself, but knowing how complete it was. How thoroughly the system had protected him and punished her for threatening his comfortable narrative. The apology was delivered the next morning in Magistrate Cornwall's office, with Whitmore present to ensure she kept to the script. Evelyn recited the words mechanically. She'd been under extreme emotional duress. She'd misinterpreted security measures as surveillance. She deeply regretted any damage her accusations had caused to Lord Cedric's reputation. The magistrate accepted her statement with visible relief, probably grateful to close a case that had threatened to expose ugly truths about aristocratic justice. And just like that, it was over. Cedric's crimes were sealed behind legal agreements and public retractions. The pattern of deaths became unfortunate accidents again. and Evelyn Hart became just another woman who had briefly been engaged to the cursed Duke of Ravenshade before fleeing in manufactured hysteria. The carriage that took her away from Ravenshade Manor left at noon. Evelyn didn't look back at the estate as it receded into the distance. Looking back felt like giving it power it didn't deserve. But she did think about Alaric, still trapped in that decaying monument to family legacy and carefully maintained lies. She thought about Sarah, keeping terrible secrets to protect her position. She thought about Mrs. Thorne serving a household that had been built on decades of covered-up crimes. And she thought about the 4 women buried in the family crypt, their deaths ruled accidental by a system that valued their killers more than their lives. Survival was supposed to be victory, but it felt like failure. The train to London was nearly empty. Evelyn claimed a private compartment and finally let herself cry, silent tears that kept coming until she thought she might drown in salt water the way Elizabeth had drowned in ice. When the tears finally stopped, she was hollow, scraped clean, fundamentally altered by the recognition that justice was a commodity available only to those who could afford it. She'd learned the lesson Ravenshade had been teaching all along, that the world was rigged in favor of men like Cedric, that fighting the system cost more than most people could pay, and that sometimes survival meant accepting defeat and calling it compromise. It was the kind of lesson that changed you permanently, that made you harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous, because once you understood how the game was rigged, you could start looking for the places where it was vulnerable, where the rules could be bent or broken by someone patient enough to wait for opportunity. Evelyn pulled out her journal and added one final entry. Cedric Blackthorne leaves for Switzerland in 3 weeks. I leave for London today. The engagement is dissolved, the case is closed, and justice, as always, remains elusive. But exile is not protection, it's just distance. And distance can be crossed by someone determined enough to finish what she started. She closed the journal and watched England blur past the window. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just evolved into something that required patience instead of immediacy, planning instead of confrontation. Cedric thought he'd won. Alaric thought she'd been saved. And the system that had protected them both thought the matter was settled. They were all wrong. But they wouldn't discover that until it was far too late to matter. The game had changed, and Evelyn Hart had learned exactly how ruthless she needed to become to play it. 6 months passed like wounds healing badly, the kind that close over infection and fester underneath until the poison spreads through your entire system. Evelyn spent those months in London rebuilding a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't learned what she'd learned at Ravenshade Manor. She wrote her society columns. She smiled at parties. She performed the role of a woman who'd narrowly escaped an unfortunate engagement to England's cursed duke, and people believed her because they wanted to believe that story. It was tidier than the truth, less complicated, less threatening to the comfortable fiction that men like Cedric Blackthorne faced consequences for their crimes. But underneath the performance, Evelyn was doing something else, something patient and methodical and absolutely merciless. She was building a case that couldn't be dismissed by expensive lawyers and legal technicalities. A case built not on testimony that could be coerced or evidence that could be explained away, but on financial records that told their own story about embezzlement and corruption and the kind of crimes that aristocracy couldn't protect you from once the numbers were laid bare. Because here's what Evelyn had understood during that train ride from Ravenshade. You couldn't fight power with truth, but you could fight power with money, or more specifically with proof that someone had stolen money from people who had the resources to make that theft very expensive. She'd started with the ledgers she'd photographed in Cedric's office, the ones tracking project continuation and payments to individuals whose names meant nothing to her at the time. 6 months of investigation, calling in favors from journalist contacts, bribing clerks who had access to banking records, tracking paper trails through shell companies and Swiss accounts, had revealed exactly what Cedric had been doing with the Ravenshade fortune. He'd been systematically draining the estate for 20 years, falsifying records, creating phantom expenses, transferring funds to his own accounts while Alaric's father gambled away what remained. And after the old duke died, Cedric had accelerated the theft, knowing that his nephew was too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to audit the books properly. The surveillance of Alaric's fiancées hadn't just been about bloodline purity. It had been about maintaining control over an heir who might eventually discover the financial devastation and demand accountability. The murders were cover for embezzlement, The eugenics obsession was justification for eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. And Project Continuation wasn't about preserving bloodlines. It was about continuing the theft until there was nothing left to steal. Evelyn had documentation now. Names, dates, amounts. Transfers that violated English law regardless of aristocratic privilege. Evidence that would interest the Crown's prosecutors and the banking authorities and all the institutions that existed to protect capital from people who tried to steal it, even if they wore titles and old family names. This was the ammunition she'd been building, the weapon she'd been sharpening in darkness, while London society thought she was just another woman recovering from scandal. And tonight, she was finally ready to use it. The letter from Ravenshade had arrived 3 days ago. Not from Alaric. They hadn't spoken since she'd left in manufactured disgrace. This was from Mrs. Thorne, her handwriting precise and controlled, even delivering devastating news. Miss Hart, Lord Cedric has returned to England. The Duke does not know. I thought you should be informed. He arrived at the estate 2 nights ago through the East Wing entrance. I discovered him in the shrine room. He said exile was temporary, that the bloodline work was unfinished, that there would be a 6th bride, and this time he would ensure she was suitable. I am an old woman who has served this family for 20 years and kept too many terrible secrets. I cannot keep this one. Whatever you plan to do with the information you gathered here, do it quickly, before someone else dies in this cursed house. T. The housekeeper had broken 30 years of rigid professionalism to send that warning, which meant the situation was desperate enough that even Mrs. Thorne, who'd survived by keeping her head down and her mouth shut, recognized that silence was no longer sustainable. Cedric had violated the terms of his exile. He'd returned to Ravenshade, and he was planning to continue exactly what he'd been doing before, because exile without prosecution was just inconvenience. Annoying, but temporary. Not actual consequence. Evelyn had taken the letter to Scotland Yard that same afternoon. She'd brought her documentation. Her evidence of embezzlement and financial fraud, her photographs and records, and the testimony of banking officials who'd confirmed the transfers. She'd laid it all out for Detective Inspector Morrison, a man whose reputation for hating aristocratic corruption was well established enough that he couldn't be bought off by Cedric's connections. Morrison had listened. He'd examined the evidence. And then he'd said the words Evelyn had been waiting 6 months to hear. This is enough for arrest warrants. Multiple charges. If even half of this stands up in court, Blackthorne will hang. Not for the murders, those were still too difficult to prove without witnesses willing to testify. But for the theft. For the decades of embezzlement that had destroyed the Ravenshade estate and violated laws that existed specifically to prevent aristocrats from looting their own family fortunes. It wasn't perfect justice. But it was the justice the system could actually deliver. Morrison had assembled a team, 6 constables and 2 detectives, all of them chosen specifically because they had no connection to the Ravenshade family or the local magistrates who'd buried 4 investigations. They were leaving for Ravenshade tonight, traveling by rail and then carriage to arrive at the estate just after midnight, when Cedric would least expect official attention. And Evelyn was going with them. Morrison had tried to talk her out of it. "You're a civilian, Miss Hart. This is police business. Dangerous business, given that Blackthorne has already tried to kill you once." But Evelyn had learned something important during her time at Ravenshade. She was only powerless when she let other people control the narrative, when she waited politely for men to make decisions about her safety and her future. The moment she stopped waiting, the moment she took action instead of reaction, the power dynamic shifted. "I'm the one who built this case," she'd told Morrison. "I'm the one who can identify the physical evidence at the estate, and I'm the one Cedric will monologue to if he thinks he can manipulate me. You need me there." Morrison had recognized the truth of that, even if he didn't like it. So now Evelyn was on a train heading north through darkness, surrounded by armed constables and carrying documentation that would finally make Cedric Blackthorne face consequences that couldn't be negotiated away by expensive solicitors. The journey took 4 hours. Evelyn spent them reviewing her evidence one more time, committing every detail to memory in case something went wrong and the physical documents were lost or destroyed. She'd made copies, of course, left them with Morrison's supervisor and with a journalist friend who'd been instructed to publish everything if Evelyn didn't return from Ravenshade within 48 hours. She'd learned from Cedric's playbook. Always have insurance. Always have leverage. Always make sure your death costs the other side more than your silence. The train arrived at Ravenshade Station just after 11. The village was dark and silent. everyone sensibly asleep or pretending to be. The constables moved with quiet efficiency, loading into 2 carriages for the ride up to the estate. Evelyn rode in the first carriage with Morrison, watching the dark woods slide past the windows and feeling something cold settle in her chest. This was it. The confrontation she'd been building toward for 6 months. Either Cedric was arrested tonight and faced trial for his crimes, or something went catastrophically wrong and she'd just led 8 people into a trap that would get them all killed. No pressure. The carriages stopped a quarter-mile from the manor, approaching on foot to avoid alerting anyone inside. Morrison deployed his constables around the perimeter, 2 at the front entrance, 2 at the servants' entrance, 2 more watching the east wing exits. The detective inspector and his partner would enter through the main door with Evelyn, heading directly for the shrine room where Mrs. Thorne had reported seeing Cedric. "You stay behind us," Morrison told Evelyn quietly. "If there's violence, you get out. Understood?" "Understood," Evelyn lied. She had no intention of running if things went bad. She'd survived one encounter with Cedric by climbing down a wall in darkness. If it came to violence again, she'd handle it the same way, with whatever tools were available and absolutely no hesitation. They approached the manor through gardens that had grown even wilder in 6 months, thorns and overgrowth making the paths nearly impassable. The main entrance was unlocked, which struck Evelyn as either careless or deliberately inviting. Cedric had to know that returning to England violated his exile agreement, had to know that someone might come looking for him, unless he thought he was untouchable. That even caught red-handed, even with evidence of embezzlement, he could still talk his way out through connections and money and the sheer weight of aristocratic privilege that had protected him his entire life. That kind of confidence was dangerous. It made people reckless, and reckless people made mistakes. The entrance hall was dark except for a single lamp burning in the corridor toward the east wing, a trail of light leading exactly where they needed to go, which felt too convenient to be coincidence. Morrison noticed it too. His hand went to his truncheon, and he gestured for his partner to take the left flank while he took the right. They moved through Ravenshade's corridors in silence, all those familiar spaces now feeling actively malevolent in the darkness. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her system in preparation for fight or flight. She'd been afraid here before, but that had been different. That had been the fear of a woman who didn't understand what she was facing. This was the fear of someone who knew exactly how dangerous the situation was and was walking into it anyway because some things were worth the risk. Justice was worth the risk. Making sure no 7th woman died was worth the risk. And maybe, proving to herself that she could face the monster again and win was worth the risk too. The east wing doors stood open. No chain, no padlock. Just an invitation into darkness and the smell of something chemical and wrong that Evelyn remembered from her first visit. They descended the stairs to the ground floor, Morrison's lamp throwing huge shadows on the walls, making everything look distorted and threatening. The shrine room door was closed but not locked. Light showed underneath, and from inside came a sound that made Evelyn's blood go cold. Humming. Someone was humming a tune that might have been a lullaby once, before it was filtered through madness and obsession. Morrison tested the door handle. It turned smoothly. He looked at Evelyn, and she nodded. Whatever was on the other side of that door, she was ready to face it, or as ready as anyone could be to confront a killer in his lair. Morrison pushed the door open. The shrine room had grown since Evelyn's last visit. More photographs covered the walls now. Not just the dead fiancés, but other women too. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. All captured without their knowledge. All sorted and categorized according to some system only Cedric understood. And in the center of it all, sitting at a desk covered in genealogical charts and purity calculations, was Lord Cedric Blackthorne. He looked up as they entered, and his expression was almost pleased, as if he'd been expecting them, as if this was all proceeding according to some plan only he could see. "Detective Inspector Morrison," Cedric said. His voice was calm, rational, the tone of someone discussing weather rather than facing arrest for multiple felonies. "And Miss Hart. How delightful. I was hoping you'd return. We have unfinished business, you and I." "Lord Cedric Blackthorne," Morrison said formally, "you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and violation of exile agreements. Additional charges pending investigation into the deaths of Elizabeth Thornberry, Caroline Ashford, Victoria Harrington, and Catherine Ashford." "Those were accidents," Cedric said. His smile didn't waver. Tragic accidents compounded by poor bloodlines. I tried to prevent them. I tried to guide my nephew towards suitable matches, but he insisted on choosing women with tainted genetics. I had no choice but to intervene. You murdered them, Evelyn said. Her voice came out steady despite the rage flooding her system. You surveilled them. You documented their routines, and then you killed them when they failed your insane purity tests or got too close to discovering your financial crimes. Financial crimes, Cedric repeated. He stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. Is that what you're calling proper estate management? I've been protecting the Ravenshade fortune for decades, making sure it wasn't squandered by wastrel heirs or diluted by unsuitable marriages. Every transfer, every expense, every decision was made to preserve the bloodline. You stole 20 million pounds, Morrison said. We have the records, the shell companies, the Swiss accounts, all of it documented and verified by banking authorities. You've been systematically looting the estate since you took over financial management. I was preserving it, Cedric said. His voice had gone cold, from incompetence and genetic contamination. My brother was a gambling fool. His son is weak and sentimental. Someone had to make hard decisions. Someone had to protect what matters. And the women? Evelyn asked. They were hard decisions too? They were necessary corrections, Cedric said. Elizabeth's family had trade connections 3 generations back. Completely unacceptable. Caroline was merchant class pretending at nobility. Victoria's mother was French. And Catherine was asking questions that would have exposed the financial restructuring before it was complete. Each one was a threat to the proper order. Each one had to be removed. He was confessing. Standing in a room full of evidence of surveillance and obsession, surrounded by police, and confessing to serial murder like it was a minor administrative detail. The arrogance was staggering. The disconnect from reality even more so. This is what happens when power never faces consequences. When someone spends their entire life insulated from accountability by money and connections and a system designed to protect them. They stop understanding that rules apply to them. They start believing their own justifications. They become something worse than evil. They become righteous in their monstrosity. Lord Blackthorne, Morrison said, you need to come with us, quietly, or my constables will make this difficult. I'm not going anywhere, Cedric said. This is my home, my family's estate. You have no authority here. We have arrest warrants signed by a magistrate, Morrison said. We have documentation of your crimes, and we have 8 armed officers surrounding this building. You can come peacefully, or you can be dragged. Those are your options. Cedric's smile finally faltered. He looked at Evelyn, and something ugly flickered across his face. This is your doing. You couldn't leave well enough alone, couldn't accept that some people are simply better than others, that bloodlines matter, that purity must be preserved. 4 women are dead because of your obsession, Evelyn said. How many more were you planning to kill? How many more unsuitable brides did Alaric have to find before you'd finally let him marry someone? As many as necessary, Cedric said. His hand moved toward the desk drawer. Until the bloodline was secure, until Morrison's truncheon was out instantly. Don't. Whatever's in that drawer, leave it there. Hands where I can see them. But Cedric was already moving, faster than a man his age should have been able to. The drawer opened and his hand emerged with a revolver, old but functional, the kind of weapon aristocrats kept for sport and never thought about as actual tools of violence. He pointed it at Evelyn with absolutely steady aim. The room went very quiet. You've ruined everything, Cedric said. Years of work, decades of careful planning, all destroyed because one stupid girl couldn't accept her place. So now you get to be the example. You get to show Alaric what happens when he chooses unsuitable women. Put the gun down, Morrison said. His voice had gone hard. Shooting a civilian in front of police officers means you hang for murder. No amount of money or connection saves you from that. I was going to hang anyway, Cedric said. According to your charges, embezzlement, fraud, multiple murders. So what's one more? At least this way I get satisfaction. Evelyn stared down the barrel of the revolver and felt something strange happen. The fear she'd been carrying for 6 months, the terror that had haunted her since climbing down Ravenshade's wall in darkness, simply evaporated, replaced by clarity so sharp it felt like a blade cutting through fog. She'd spent half a year being afraid of this man, building a case against him, planning this confrontation. And now that it was finally happening, now that she was facing death again, she realized something fundamental. Cedric Blackthorne was pathetic, not dangerous, though he was absolutely that, standing there with a loaded weapon. But underneath the violence and the obsession and the aristocratic entitlement was just a frightened old man who'd built his entire identity on being better than other people, on genetic superiority and bloodline purity and all the comforting lies that let him justify theft and murder as necessary corrections. He had nothing else. No genuine relationships. No accomplishments beyond stealing from his own family. No legacy except corpses and embezzlement. He was empty. And empty people were always the most dangerous when cornered because they had nothing to lose except the fantasy they'd built to avoid confronting their own worthlessness. "You're not going to shoot me," Evelyn said. Her voice came out calm, almost gentle. "Because if you do, you prove everything I've been saying about you. That you're not protecting bloodlines, you're just a murderer who uses eugenics to justify violence against women who threaten your control." "I am protecting—" "You're protecting your own relevance," Evelyn interrupted. "Your brother was a gambling fool, yes, but you were the one managing the finances. You were the one who let the debts pile up while you transferred money to your own accounts. You weren't saving the estate, you were looting it. And when Alaric's fiancé started asking questions or showing independence or just being human instead of broodmares, you killed them to maintain the fiction that you were the responsible one. The protector. The one who made hard decisions." Cedric's hand was shaking now. "You don't understand. The bloodline." "There is no bloodline," Evelyn said. "There's just you, alone, surrounded by photographs of women you murdered and money you stole. That's your legacy. Not purity, not protection, just theft and corpses." The gun barrel wavered. For a moment, just one moment, Evelyn thought he might actually lower it, that the weight of his own failure might crash through the delusions he'd built to avoid facing what he'd become. Then the library door exploded inward. Alaric Ravenshade entered like violence given human form. He'd clearly been in the estate already. His clothes were dusty from climbing or crawling through servant passages. His face was pale with rage and something else, something that looked like he'd finally stopped trying to survive circumstances and started fighting to change them. He saw Cedric pointing a gun at Evelyn and didn't hesitate, didn't try to negotiate or de-escalate. Just crossed the room in 3 strides and slammed into his uncle with enough force to send them both crashing into the wall. The gun went off. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and for one heart-stopping moment, Evelyn couldn't tell where the bullet had gone. Then Morrison was pulling her back, his partner was shouting for the constables, and Alaric and Cedric were fighting like animals on the floor of the shrine room. Alaric had 40 years of youth and size advantage, but Cedric fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. They rolled across the floor, knocking over furniture and scattering photographs. Cedric still had the gun. Evelyn could see it in his hand, see him trying to bring it around toward Alaric's head. The Duke caught his uncle's wrist and slammed it against the stone floor once, twice, 3 times until the revolver skittered away across the room. Morrison dove for the weapon. Alaric pinned Cedric to the floor with a knee on his chest and his hands around his uncle's throat. And for just a moment, Evelyn saw murder in the Duke's face. Saw him calculating whether killing Cedric here and now was worth whatever consequences followed. "Your Grace," Morrison said sharply. "Don't. He's not worth hanging for." Alaric's hands tightened fractionally. Cedric's face was going purple, his hands clawing uselessly at his nephew's arms. The shrine room was silent except for choking sounds and harsh breathing and the terrible weight of a decision being made in real time. Then Alaric released him, stood up, looked down at his uncle gasping and coughing on the floor and said in a voice like broken glass, "You killed Elizabeth. You killed all of them, and you were going to kill her too." He gestured at Evelyn without looking at her. Cedric wheezed something that might have been justification, but Alaric just turned away. Walked to the far side of the room, put his hands against the wall and stood there with his head down and his whole body shaking. Morrison's partner moved in with handcuffs, secured Cedric's wrists behind his back while reading him charges that had expanded to include attempted murder of a civilian and assaulting police officers. The constables flooded into the room from their perimeter positions, and suddenly the shrine that had been Cedric's private kingdom was full of law enforcement documenting evidence and photographing walls and treating the space like what it actually was, a crime scene. Evelyn moved to Alaric. She didn't touch him, just stood close enough that he'd know she was there. The Duke's breathing was ragged, his knuckles white where his hands pressed against stone. "You came back," she said quietly. Mrs. Thorne sent me a telegram, Alaric said. His voice was rough. Told me Cedric had returned, that you'd gone to Scotland Yard with evidence, that you were coming here tonight. I couldn't let you face him alone again. I wasn't alone, Evelyn said. I had Morrison and 6 constables. Still, Alaric said, you shouldn't have had to be here. Shouldn't have had to build a case and face a killer because I was too weak to stop him the first time. You stopped him now, Evelyn said. That's what matters. Alaric finally turned to look at her. His pale eyes were devastated. I almost let him shoot you. I was in the corridor. I heard him confessing, and I froze, just for a second, because part of me thought if you died, at least I wouldn't have to live with knowing I'd failed to protect a 6th woman. Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. That wasn't weakness. That was trauma. 5 years of watching women die and being blamed for their deaths. Anyone would freeze. I didn't, though, Alaric said. Freeze completely. I got through the door, but those seconds when I stood there calculating whether to intervene, those are going to haunt me as much as the ones where I let Cedric walk free the first time. Around them, constables were removing Cedric from the shrine room. The old man was shouting now about bloodlines and purity and how history would vindicate his actions. No one was listening. He'd become what he'd always been underneath the aristocratic Polish, just another criminal being hauled away to face consequences he'd spent decades avoiding. Morrison approached them with evidence bags full of documents. Miss Hart, you'll need to come to the station. Give a formal statement about what happened here. Both attempts on your life. I'll come now, Evelyn said. Let's finish this. Your Grace, Morrison said to Alaric, you'll need to give a statement as well about your uncle's embezzlement and your knowledge of the murders. Alaric nodded mutely. The detective inspector moved away to coordinate with his team, leaving Evelyn and Alaric alone in the wreckage of Cedric's shrine. What happens now? Evelyn asked. Now there's a trial, Alaric said. Very public. Very ugly. Every detail of what my uncle did will be exposed. The embezzlement, the murders. All of it. The Ravenshade name, what's left of it, will be completely destroyed. Good, Evelyn said. Let it burn. Build something new from the ashes. Alaric looked at her for a long moment. You're terrifying, Miss Hart. You know that? I learned from the best, Evelyn said. Cedric taught me that the system protects power. You taught me that sometimes you have to choose between survival and justice. And the past 6 months taught me that the only way to beat people who think they're untouchable is to become more ruthless than they are. That's not the lesson I wanted you to learn, Alaric said. It's the lesson this place teaches, Evelyn said. But maybe we can teach something different. Once the trial is over, once the estate is seized to pay back what Cedric stole, maybe we can show that consequence is possible, that justice, delayed and imperfect as it might be, eventually catches up to monsters. Alaric was quiet for a moment, then, the engagement, the one we dissolved in disgrace, would you consider— No, Evelyn interrupted, but there was no heat in it. Not like that. Not with contracts and settlements and all the machinery that made me a transaction instead of a person. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to build something real in the ruins of this nightmare, it has to be honest, equal, with both of us choosing it freely instead of being forced into it by debts or curses or family obligation. So what are you suggesting? Alaric asked. I'm suggesting we start over, Evelyn said, after the trial. After Cedric hangs or spends the rest of his life in prison. After the scandal dies down and the estate is settled, we start as 2 people who survived the same nightmare and maybe want to see if survival can turn into something more. That could take years, Alaric said. Then it takes years, Evelyn said. I've already waited 6 months. I can wait longer for something real. Alaric's hand moved slowly, carefully, until it brushed against hers. Not quite holding, just touching, just acknowledging that they were both here, both alive, both damaged, but not destroyed. Your Grace, Morrison called from the corridor. We need to move. The magistrate wants statements tonight while everything's fresh. Coming, Alaric called back. He looked at Evelyn one more time. Thank you for building the case, for coming back, for not giving up when every sane person would have. I'm not sane, Evelyn said. I'm stubborn. There's a difference. Then Alaric Ravenshade did something Evelyn had never seen him do in all their encounters. He smiled. Not the cold mask he showed the world, but something genuine and real and utterly exhausted. Stubborn is good, he said. Stubborn survives. They walked out of the shrine room together, leaving Cedric's photographs and genealogical charts and obsessive documentation to be catalogued as evidence. Behind them, the East Wing felt less oppressive, as if removing the monster who'd made it his hunting ground had broken whatever terrible atmosphere had accumulated there over 5 years of surveillance and murder. The constables were loading Cedric into a police wagon. He was still shouting, but the words had degraded into incoherent rage. Whatever careful rationality he'd maintained before was gone now, burned away by the recognition that his perfect system of protection had finally failed. That money and connections and aristocratic privilege couldn't save him from the consequences of stealing 20 million pounds and murdering 4 women. Evelyn watched the wagon pull away down the Ravenshade Drive and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly. Not quite relief. Just the grim recognition that justice, when it finally came, was never as clean or complete as you wanted it to be. 4 women were still dead, their families still grieving, and Cedric got to live at least long enough for trial, which was more mercy than he'd shown any of his victims. But he was caught. He would face trial. And with Morrison's evidence and Evelyn's documentation and Sarah's testimony, because the kitchen maid had finally agreed to speak once she knew other witnesses existed, he would almost certainly hang. That would have to be enough, because it was all the justice this world had to offer. The ride to the magistrate's office took an hour through darkness that felt less threatening now. Evelyn sat across from Morrison in the carriage, reviewing her notes one more time. Alaric rode in the second carriage with the detective inspector's partner, probably doing the same mental preparation for the statements ahead. When they finally arrived at the magistrate's building, dawn was starting to break. Pale light filtered through windows as they were led into separate rooms to give their accounts of what had happened. Evelyn described everything, both confrontations with Cedric, the shrine room, the attempted murder, Alaric's intervention. She spoke clinically, precisely, the way she'd learned to write investigative articles. Just the facts, just what happened. Let the events speak for themselves. It took 3 hours. By the time she emerged, exhausted and hollow, the sun was fully up, and the magistrate's staff were arriving for normal business to find their building transformed into the processing center for England's biggest aristocratic scandal in decades. Alaric was waiting in the corridor. He looked as tired as Evelyn felt, all that adrenaline burned away and leaving just bone-deep exhaustion. They stared at each other for a moment, 2 people who just dismantled a killer's empire and had no idea what came next. "Breakfast?" Alaric suggested. His voice was hoarse from hours of testimony. "God, yes," Evelyn said. They found a cafe 2 blocks away, the kind of place that catered to early morning workers and didn't care about aristocratic scandal. The owner took one look at them, dirty, exhausted, covered in dust from the shrine room fight, and just brought tea and toast without asking questions. Evelyn ate mechanically. Alaric stared at his plate. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with suspicion or calculation, just 2 people too tired to maintain social performance. "What will you do?" Alaric asked finally. "After the trial. After everything." "Go back to journalism," Evelyn said. "Write the story everyone needs to hear about how the system protects killers when they're wealthy enough. Maybe start investigating other aristocratic families to see how many more Cedrics are out there committing crimes behind titles and old names." "That will make you very unpopular with society," Alaric said. "Good," Evelyn said. "I'm done caring what society thinks. Society thought you were cursed. Society thought Cedric was respectable. Society's judgment is worth exactly nothing." Alaric's lips twitched in something that might have been amusement. "And us? What happens when you're done exposing aristocratic corruption and I'm done salvaging what's left of the estate? Then we see if survival can turn into partnership," Evelyn said. "If 2 people who've been through hell can build something that isn't defined by trauma or scandal or curses that were really just murder all along." "I'd like that," Alaric said quietly. "More than I can articulate right now with how exhausted I am. But yes, I'd like that very much." They finished breakfast in silence. Then Morrison appeared in the cafe doorway, looking grim. "The magistrate wants to see you both," he said. "There's been a complication." Evelyn's exhaustion evaporated instantly. "What kind of complication?" "The kind where Cedric Blackthorne just collapsed in his cell," Morrison said. "Medical examiner thinks it was poison. Self-administered, Probably something he had hidden on him. He's dead. The cafe went very quiet. Evelyn felt something cold spread through her chest. No. Not like this. Not before trial. Not before he could be made to answer publicly for what he'd done. I'm sorry, Morrison said. I know you wanted him to face justice properly, but at least he won't kill again. He won't face judgment either, Evelyn said. Won't be forced to hear victim testimony. Won't have to sit through evidence being presented. He gets to escape on his own terms. He died in a cell awaiting trial for murder and embezzlement, Morrison said, his reputation destroyed. His name synonymous with scandal. That's not nothing. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. 4 dead women deserve to see their killer face public accountability, deserve to have their families watch him convicted and sentenced and led to the gallows. Instead, Cedric had taken the coward's way out. One final act of control in a life built on controlling and destroying others. Evelyn stood abruptly. I need air. She walked out of the cafe into morning sunlight that felt too bright, too normal for a world where killers could escape justice by dying before trial. Behind her, she heard Alaric following, but she didn't stop until she'd reached a small park where early morning commuters were starting their days completely unaware that 20 minutes away, England's biggest murder case in years had just ended in a cell instead of a courtroom. Miss Hart, Alaric said quietly. Evelyn, he died, she said. Just died. After everything. After 6 months building a case that should have been ironclad. After dragging him back to face consequence. He just poisoned himself and escaped. He also died knowing he'd lost, Alaric said. Knowing that everything he built was destroyed. That his life's work protecting bloodline purity was exposed as fraud and murder. That his name will be remembered as a cautionary tale instead of a noble protector of aristocratic values. That's something. It's not justice, Evelyn said. No, Alaric agreed. It's not. But it might be the closest we get. They stood there in the park while the city woke around them. 2 people who'd survived a nightmare only to discover that nightmares didn't end cleanly. That sometimes the monster died before facing judgment. That justice was always incomplete and imperfect and never quite enough to heal the wounds left behind. But they'd survived. That was something. They'd exposed the truth. They'd made sure Cedric's crimes would be known instead of buried. And maybe, they'd prevented a 6th victim from being added to the toll. It would have to be enough, because it was all they had. Evelyn turned to face Alaric. The engagement papers, the dissolution. Can we undo that? Alaric's eyes widened. You want to reinstate, not the engagement, Evelyn interrupted, but the connection, the choice to try. I know I said we should wait until after the trial, but there's not going to be a trial now. Just scandal and investigation, and eventually the truth being published in every newspaper in England. And I don't want to spend that time alone. I don't want you to face it alone either. What are you suggesting? Alaric asked carefully. I'm suggesting partnership, Evelyn said. Real partnership, built on honesty and shared trauma and the decision to turn survival into something more. Not marriage. Not yet. Maybe not ever if we discover we're better as allies than as spouses. But connection. Support. The acknowledgement that we went through hell together and came out the other side changed but not broken. Alaric was quiet for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Partnership, he agreed. Honest. Equal. With both of us choosing it freely. Evelyn took his hand. Behind them, Morrison was approaching with more paperwork and questions and all the machinery of legal process that would consume the next several months. Ahead of them was scandal and investigation and the slow work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by Cedric's obsession. But in this moment, standing in morning sunlight with their hands clasped and the nightmare finally, truly over, they were just 2 people who'd learned the hardest possible way that survival was only the beginning. That building something real from trauma took more courage than facing death ever had. Morrison cleared his throat. I hate to interrupt, but there are approximately 50 more statements the magistrate needs, and the press has gotten wind of Lord Blackthorn's death. It's going to be a circus. Then let's give them a show, Evelyn said. She looked at Alaric. Ready? The Duke, no longer cursed, no longer isolated, just a man trying to rebuild in the ruins of his family's sins, nodded. Ready. They walked toward Morrison and the chaos waiting beyond, hands still clasped, prepared to face whatever came next together. The nightmare was over. The real work, the work of healing and building and proving that justice mattered even when it was delayed and incomplete, was just beginning. The scandal broke like a storm across England, the kind that tears through carefully maintained social hierarchies and leaves nothing unchanged in its wake. Within 48 hours of Cedric Blackthorne's death, every major newspaper from London to Edinburgh was running headlines that competed to capture the magnitude of aristocratic corruption finally exposed. The Times called it the Ravenshade murders. The Observer went with bloodline of death. The more sensational papers simply ran photographs of the shrine room with captions that needed no elaboration. Evelyn watched the media frenzy from a hotel room in London that Morrison had arranged for her protection. Not because she was in danger anymore, Cedric was dead, his conspiracy collapsed, but because journalists would pay obscene amounts for exclusive interviews with the woman who'd survived the cursed Duke's engagement and exposed a serial killer. She'd given one statement to the press, carefully worded and factual, then refused all further requests. The story would tell itself through court documents and police reports. She didn't need to perform her trauma for public consumption. Alaric had retreated to Ravenshade Manor, which was now swarming with investigators cataloging evidence and accountants trying to untangle 20 years of embezzlement. The estate would be seized eventually, sold to pay back what Cedric had stolen. The Ravenshade title would survive. Hereditary peerages didn't die just because their holders were broke and infamous, but everything else was forfeit. The manor, the lands, the investments. All of it liquidated to compensate the banks and institutions Cedric had defrauded. It was exactly what the Duke had feared 6 months ago. Complete financial annihilation. The end of everything his family had built over centuries. Except now, facing it with eyes open and the truth finally exposed, Alaric had told Evelyn it felt less like devastation and more like liberation, like finally being free from the weight of maintaining a legacy built on lies and blood money. That's what happens when you stop trying to preserve something that's already rotten. You discover that demolition can be its own form of progress, that sometimes burning everything down is the only way to make sure nothing toxic survives to poison the next generation. The trial that never happened became an inquest instead. Magistrate Cornwall presided over weeks of testimony from servants, banking officials, and forensic investigators who'd examined every document in Cedric's office. Sarah Collins testified about the late-night activities in the East Wing. Mrs. Thorne testified about suspicious deaths and investigations that went nowhere. And medical examiners presented evidence that 3 of the 4 deceased fiancés showed signs consistent with murder rather than accident. Elizabeth Thornberry had bruises on her wrists and ankles that suggested she'd been held down while the ice broke beneath her. Victoria Harrington's heart failure had been caused by poisoning, specifically arsenic administered in small doses over several weeks. Catherine Ashford's neck had been broken before she fell down the stairs, not as a result of falling. Only Caroline Ashford's death remained ambiguous. Her body had never been found, and without remains there was no way to prove cause of death. But the pattern was clear enough. 4 women engaged to Duke Alaric Ravenshade, 4 women who died under suspicious circumstances, and 1 man with motive, opportunity, and a documented obsession with bloodline purity who'd been present for every single death. The inquest ruled that Lord Cedric Blackthorne had murdered Elizabeth Thornberry, Victoria Harrington, and Catherine Ashford, and was the primary suspect in Caroline Ashford's disappearance and presumed death. His suicide was recorded as an admission of guilt, and Duke Alaric Ravenshade was formally cleared of any involvement in the deaths. The curse officially declared a fabrication designed to cover systematic murder. It should have felt like vindication, like justice, however delayed and incomplete. Instead, it just felt empty. 4 women were still dead, their families still grieving, and the man responsible had escaped accountability by dying in a cell before facing public judgment. But here's what Evelyn had learned about justice during those weeks of inquest and investigation. It was never about revenge or satisfaction. It was about truth. About making sure the record reflected what actually happened instead of comfortable lies. About ensuring that future victims would have a foundation of documented evidence to stand on when they tried to expose similar crimes. 4 women had died without justice, but their deaths were now officially recognized as murders rather than accidents. Their families could grieve knowing the truth, and anyone investigating suspicious deaths in aristocratic households would have the Ravenshade case as precedent, proof that wealth and titles didn't make you immune to prosecution, just harder to convict while alive. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you got. 3 months after Cedric's death, the estate sale was finalized. Ravenshade Manor and its lands were purchased by a consortium of investors who planned to convert the property into a country hotel. The furnishings were auctioned off to collectors and museums. And the East Wing, that cursed section where Cedric had built his shrine to obsession and murder, was scheduled for demolition and reconstruction. Evelyn attended the final day of the auction with Alaric. They walked through rooms that had witnessed so much tragedy and saw them reduced to lot numbers and estimated values. The library where they'd first confronted Cedric became Lot 47, assorted books and furnishings. The dining room where Evelyn had challenged the Duke on her first night became Lot 23, antique table and chairs, 18th century. Every space stripped of context and history, transformed into commodities for wealthy collectors who wanted the aesthetic of aristocracy without its actual weight. "How does it feel?" Evelyn asked as they watched a Ravenshade family portrait being carried away by its new owner. Watching everything disappear. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, like watching a terminal patient finally die. Sad, yes, but also relieved that the suffering is over. This house has been a mausoleum for decades. Maybe as a hotel, it can finally become something that brings life instead of death. They left before the East Wing demolition began. Some things Alaric didn't need to witness. But Evelyn had insisted on staying, on watching the shrine room reduced to rubble and dust. She'd stood in the gardens while construction crews tore down walls and hauled away debris, and she'd felt something shift in her chest. Some tension she'd been carrying since her first night at Ravenshade finally releasing its grip. The shrine was gone. The photographs destroyed. The physical space where Cedric had planned and celebrated his murders erased from existence. It didn't bring back the dead, but it meant no one else would stand in that room and feel the weight of all that concentrated malevolence. That night, Evelyn and Alaric had dinner at a small restaurant in the village. The locals had been wary of them at first, the Duke who'd been accused of murder and the woman who'd exposed the real killer. But as the truth became public knowledge, as the inquest findings were published and discussed, the wariness had transformed into something else. Not quite warmth, but acknowledgement. Respect for two people who'd torn down a corrupt system even when it cost them everything. The restaurant owner brought them wine without asking, and they sat by the window watching the sun set over hills that would soon belong to hotel developers and investors rather than the Ravenshade family. "What will you do now?" Evelyn asked. "After the estate is fully liquidated, after the title is all that's left." Alaric smiled, and it was still strange seeing genuine expression on a face that had been frozen in an aristocratic mask for so long. "I've been offered a position with the Crown Prosecution Service.